This is part 2 of a two-party audio story that is titled My Tenure as a High-Paid Tourist. This was our adventure as we travelling in Asian socialist countries to gather information in 1990. If you haven't listened to part 1, please go back and listen to it first, which will make more sense of this mini-adventure. I hope you enjoy it. Janet Sable.
We lay face down, and the two women began their massage with skillful hands. With my eyes closed, I heard Janet call my name. I turned to her, and she briefly raised up to reveal her right breast, flashing a smile and winking at me. The massage lasted around 40 minutes, and afterward, two different and older women came into the room and sat beside us. As soon as the massage concluded, they treated both of us to warm mask facials and a foot massage. Janet shared that she was having one of the most romantic moments of her life and wanted to repeat this experience every day. She jokingly called me Mr. James Bond. As the clock neared 8 p.m., the spa was closing, and we needed to return to the hotel. Janet asked if I wanted to purchase another movie, as most street vendors would be closing around 9. However, I declined, suggesting that we simply go to sleep. She laughed and agreed, saying, "Yes, let's go to sleep, and no hanky-panky." In the morning, our plan was to depart from the city of Hue and head towards Kisan. However, I spotted a junk shop and thought it might be worth a stop to see if I could find some former American or Vietnamese shoulder or pocket insignia, which I collect. Unfortunately, there were no insignia in the shop, but I did come across some old 1700-type handcuffs. When Janet asked why I wanted them, I playfully suggested we could use them at night. She didn't find humor in that comment. Nonetheless, I was interested in finding a pair that would fit my hand, thinking they could fetch a high price back in the U.S. The shop owner showed me a couple of different sets, then took one out of my hand and placed it back on the sloping tray of handcuffs before leaving the store. Assuming his wife was there, I picked up the pair the owner had put back and offered to buy it. To test the fit, I placed it on my hand, and it unexpectedly locked. Janet, growing tired, told me to stop playing around. Jokingly, I took the other end and placed it on her right hand, and it locked as well. To make a long story short, the reason the owner didn't want me to see that set was that it had no key, and now Janet and I were handcuffed on our right hands. She found no humor in the situation, and I decided to buy the cuffs and have them cut off. The woman in the shop, realizing what had happened, demanded $200 US dollars for the handcuffs, while others in the shop were only $3 to $5. Janet urged me to pay so we could have them removed. A saw was brought out to cut them off, but the blade broke. To make a long story even shorter, we had to remain handcuffed until the following day when new saw blades could be purchased. We were stuck in the city of Hue. This meant Janet and I had to return to the hotel, where she had to walk backward or we had to walk close to each other, as the cuffs were on our right hands. Mr. Heapus to translate to the hotel clerk, who thought it was extremely funny. We had to use the bathroom together and sleep on the same bed, with one facing down while the other faced up. The hotel sent out to get someone to come to hotel, but they did not arrive until early morning. The little Vietnamese man who was sent to our room asked if we were criminals on the run, and he kept laughing as he began cutting the cuffs off our wrists. I was surprised that Janet was only mildly upset by the whole ordeal. In fact, she only hit me 3 times, and once more when she was released. Much later, we would laugh about it. It was the early afternoon before we continued the trip to Kisan. I had heard that there were no hotels or accommodations there, so we were prepared to sleep in the van. Our van had 5 rows of seats, but the journey wasn't going to be easy. The road was in terrible condition, with potholes upon potholes filled with mud and water. It was impossible to gauge their depth until we drove into one. Our entire tire was submerged, and we could feel the van scraping the muddy bottom. We had to stop and seek help from passers-by to push the van out of the hole. We spoke to a man riding his Honda, and he informed us that some dirt roads had been washed out, and in certain areas there were no roads due to landslides. He believed it was nearly impossible to reach Kisan under these conditions. After we managed to free the van from the mud hole, our driver suggested there was a park on the right side of the road. We made a right turn and passed by a large 2-story brick building, standing alone in an open field with no other structures around it. It was as if someone had placed there dropped a 2-story brick building in the middle of a rice field. As our driver inquired with other locals, we received the same discouraging news. The roads were washed out. We were now looking for a way to turn around, but there were no alternate routes available or possible way to turn the van around. Our only options were either to reverse for 3 kilometers or continue further to seek a suitable turnaround point. We entered what appeared to be a park, where we found a place to get drinks and possibly food. In the park, there were several older men working in the gardens, approximately 6 of them. They were engaged in tasks like weeding and raking. I decided to approach them and take some photographs when suddenly a soldier stepped forward and firmly told me, while gesturing for me to leave, saying, "Condi, no go way." Moments later, Mr. Heap joined me, and he explained that the guard had revealed that these were former South Vietnamese officers being held in the Vietnamese POW camp. He suggested that I might be able to take photos if we offered the soldier a little money. I decided to offer the guard 5,000 dong, and he reluctantly agreed, but not before glancing at Janet and hearing her say something in Vietnamese. Mr. Heap chuckled and mentioned that I had probably given the guard a month's worth of wages. Approaching one of the elderly men who had been studying me, I was greeted by an unexpected question in English from one of the laborers, asking if I was American. I confirmed that I was, and he implored, "Help us, we are all soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army." Mr. Heap and I exchanged glances. He then spoke to Mr. Heap while he offered the man a cigarette, uncertain of what else I could do. The prisoner accepted the cigarette, and Mr. Heap suggested that I purchase a pack of cigarettes for these men. I returned to the cafe store, where two young girls seemed intrigued by me, giggling and flirting in typical Vietnamese fashion. I signaled for cigarettes, and they brought out 6 different packs from various manufacturers. I took them all and held out my money so they could take the required amount from my water bills. Meanwhile, Janet had been exploring the area among the flowering plants. When she saw me buying the cigarettes, she returned to the van, thinking I was carrying out my mission and preferring not to be involved. I walked back to elderly prisoner and handed him a pack of cigarettes, and the other men in his group gathered around to receive their packs as well. They accepted the cigarettes with great respect, using both hands. I asked the man, who spoke English, if there was anything more I could do to help. He reiterated his plea for assistance. I inquired if he had ever seen any prisoners, perhaps Americans, still being held captive. He recounted that many years ago he had heard men speaking English, but those English-speaking prisoners were always held separately. The guard returned and noticed that I had given the prisoners cigarettes, which they were now placing in their pockets. I discreetly handed him 4,500 dong notes, putting my finger to my lips to emphasize silence about this gesture. He appeared pleased and nodded in agreement. Then the guard signaled that it was time for us to leave, cautiously scanning the surroundings to check if anyone had witnessed our interaction. As we departed, the elderly men bowed to me, with one of them coming to attention and saluting me. I took some photos of them, and then we returned to the van after buying a couple of cold soda cans. Mr. Heap informed me that these were former South Vietnamese officers who wished for me to contact the U.S. government and inform them that not all Vietnamese POWs had been released. Mr. Heap suggested that there was a road to the left that could lead us to the site where deceased prisoners were buried. With some reluctance, our driver guided us down that road, and we eventually stopped behind a cluster of trees atop a ridge that provided a vantage point overlooking the valley below. Heap, Janet, and I cautiously approached the edge of the hillside, peering through the bushes to observe an open pit used for unmarked graves. There were no tombstones, just a vast, open hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hill, a truck pulled up, discharging 8 soldiers and 4 prisoners donned in striped uniforms. It appeared they were going to bury more bodies. However, I had my doubts about these 4 men, and they seemed more like convicts than traditional POWs. Mr. Heap said convict wore stripped uniform, while Vietnamese POW were generally dressed in rags. Soon, another vehicle arrived, carrying men dressed in black attire. White bags were placed over the heads of the prisoners, and these individuals were tied to telephone poles. 8 poles stood in a row along the flat area. The soldiers pointed their guns at these 4 men and opened fire. Subsequently, one of the guards approached each deceased man and shot them in the head. I captured photographs of this gruesome scene, while Mr. Heap used my small handheld movie camera to film approximately 3 minutes of it. To my surprise, Janet appeared somewhat indifferent to the brutality. The driver, growing increasingly anxious, informed Mr. Heap that we needed to leave immediately. We returned to the van and drove away cautiously. Mr. Heap shared that he was unsure about the identities of these prisoners, speculating that they might not have been officers but perhaps criminals involved in drug-related activities. He mentioned that he had witnessed former Vietnamese officers in labor camps but had never seen any dressed in striped clothing like those individuals. I asked Janet for her thoughts on the situation, and she calmly explained that such occurrences were a daily reality for her, so witnessing such events did not greatly shock her. We continued our journey toward Khe Sanh, thinking we might still be able to make it. We talked to passerby inquiring of an alternate routes. We were guided by information from a man on a Honda who had suggested that the hillside drive might be passable. As we continued along the hillside road, it became evident that a portion of it had been washed away, requiring the installation of a suspension bridge to cross a ravine. Alternatively, we could navigate a steep dirt hillside, cross a river, and ascend the opposite hill, albeit on a narrow path that lacks sufficient space for us to turn around if needed. The driver, concerned about the road conditions, stopped and turned around in his seat. He expressed uncertainty about our ability to reach Kisan. He explained that if the road were to end abruptly, turning the van around would be challenging, potentially leaving us stranded in a remote area vulnerable to bandit activity. He assured us that he had access to an expense account to facilitate our rescue, but being stuck for several days was a possibility. As we deliberated our next move, a local passerby with his water buffalo approached us. He advised us that reaching Kisan was highly unlikely due to the lack of passable roads. With this information, and considering the flood reports on the road to Kisan, we decided to reverse course and head back to Hue. The risk of getting stuck in bandit-prone territory far outweighed any potential benefits of continuing the journey. It's not worth the risk of getting stuck out there in bandit country. I wasn't overly concerned about my own safety, but rather more so about Janet, given the circumstances. However, Janet reassured me not to worry about her, as she was more than capable of handling any situation on her own. She revealed that she had undergone survival training school when she was in the Philippines, where she had to live off the land for 5 days. Janet was a resourceful and independent individual. Despite my curiosity about her true affiliations, she always managed to deflect my questions, skillfully changing the subject. We began our descent down the mountain, encountering a couple of accidents along the way. One involved a truck that had rolled off the road, colliding with a bus carrying barrels of gasoline. The impact had caused a spark, igniting the gasoline and resulting in the complete destruction of the bus. Fortunately, all the bodies had already been removed from the scene. The blacktop road we were traveling on was only wide enough for 2 cars, with no side rails to prevent a vehicle from veering off the side of the mountain onto another winding road below. We made our way back to another crash site, and memories flooded back to the time when I had lived in this area known as LZ Professional. The road ahead of us was damaged due to the recent rains, but a crew was working on repairs, with the promise that it would be open by the next day. Mr. Heap suggested that we return to Tamkai, find a motel, and come back the following day to continue our journey. As we traveled, I spotted a hilltop that stirred memories of American presence in the area. Since I couldn't boast about staying overnight in Kisan, spending the night at this old LZ firebase seemed like an alternative. When I shared this plan with Mr. Heap, he thought I was crazy. I told them to pick me up in the morning on the road below. We asked some locals if there was a road leading up the hill, but they informed us that there wasn't. However, they showed me a relatively straightforward path to reach the hill's summit. Janet expressed interest in accompanying me, but I declined, explaining that it was something I wanted to do alone. I packed my Alice backpack, grabbed a canteen of water and a half-empty quart water bottle before starting my ascent on the trail. They watched me for a while before driving off, probably thinking that I might change my mind. After climbing a few hundred feet, I started to regret my decision. In the beginning, the ascent was relatively manageable as I cut through the scrub, but soon the rocky terrain became more challenging. For every 20 feet I climbed, I'd slide back 30. To make matters worse, the rain started falling, a common occurrence in Vietnam, where bad weather always had the potential to get worse. The rain washed away what I had considered a makeshift mountain goat path, causing me to slide down into a gully where I muttered curses at myself. It struck me that, despite my disdain for the rain during the war, here I was 2 decades later, scaling a mountainside in the rain. I questioned my motivation. Why was I doing this? They weren't paying me for it, so who cared about this endeavor other than me? Before leaving the van, Janet had jokingly cautioned me not to be one of those crazy vets. I laughed and admitted that maybe I was, and perhaps that's why I found myself in this country. As I clung to shrubs on the rocky hillside, I sometimes lost my grip, sending me tumbling downhill, only to start the arduous climb again. I wished I could turn back, but there was no easy way down, and the thick weeds made it even more challenging. The rains had obliterated the small animal path I had been following, forcing me to push my way through dense vegetation with nothing to hold on to except the occasional tree limb. By the time I reached the summit, darkness was settling in. It struck me as somewhat ironic that back during my days in Vietnam, I often arrived at jungle fire bases in the late evening, never having enough time to properly survey the surroundings or find a spot that offered good fields of fire and protection. 21 years later, the situation seemed eerily similar. This LZ, which was probably once cleared of all vegetation during the war, had now been swallowed up by dense undergrowth. I could faintly discern traces of what might have once been a bunker line. It could have been one of the LZS I had spent time on, but it was nearly impossible to confirm now. I spread out my military poncho next to some old rotting ammo boxes. I wished I had a knife or some form of self-defense, but all I had was a tree limb I had used to beat through the thick vegetation. I laid my Alice pack down and closed my eyes, allowing my mind to drift back in time. The first thing I noticed was that I was sweating profusely, and I couldn't help but think, am I back in 1969 again? The mosquitoes returned with a vengeance, just like they had in those distant days. I imagined these were their descendants, drawn by the scent of American blood. They swarmed around me, feasting on my flesh. I pulled out my only long-sleeved shirt and put it on, then wrapped myself in the rain poncho. But the mosquitoes persisted, buzzing in my ears as they had done decades ago. Now, drenched in sweat, I found myself yearning for the rain once more, a wish I would soon regret. My wish came true at 1 a.m. When the rain started falling, I awoke to the familiar sound of raindrops, transported back to so many of those miserable nights in the monsoon rain and freezing cold up in the mountains. I couldn't help but wonder if Mr. Heap was sitting in a bar with two beautiful, alluring women on each side of him, sharing laughter about the crazy American he had left out on a jungle hilltop. At least I didn't have to worry about the VC. Or did I? I strained my ears, listening to the noises that seemed to approach up the hill in front of me. I kept my attention on the sounds for a good half hour before they abruptly ceased. It must have been rats, I thought, trying to reassure myself. I stayed awake for most of the morning, drifting in and out of flashbacks, some pleasant but most not so pleasant. Daylight arrived early, with the sun beaming into my eyes, and I found myself sweating again. The morning dew and the distinct scent of Vietnam in 1968 enveloped me, accompanied by a chilling feeling. I rose from my makeshift bed, brushing off the dirt and sand that clung to my clothing. I had slept on old sandbags, remnants from a time long past. I packed everything into my backpack and began my descent down the hillside. Going down was considerably easier and quicker than the grueling climb up. As I descended, I couldn't help but picture firefights and gunships hovering overhead, unleashing their firepower. Fast movers skinned the treetops, releasing their payloads of napalm. I spotted a clearing ahead, perhaps a former helipad, now just a hillside opening. An animal trail led me down to what appeared to be a road. I embarked on my descent, occasionally stumbling and rolling a couple of times, gathering what I affectionately called a chuckleburst along the way. Descending took me around 30 minutes, but the ascent had been nearly 2 hours of relentless effort. I began walking along the race dikes of the rice paddies, casting glances to either side, half expecting to see the bamboo poles that were once used to impale American soldiers' feet during the war. I briefly considered walking through the water in the rice paddy, which was about 2 feet deep, but the thought of hidden snakes dissuaded me. I came to a halt, took a moment to look around, and couldn't help but chastise myself for my imprudent choice. The whole situation seemed ridiculous. I could have spent the previous night in a comfortable hotel, yet here I was traipsing across rice paddy dikes, fretting about the possibility of falling into a water-filled field and emerging covered in leeches. As I crossed the lengthy dike making my way toward the road, I spotted a farmer standing on the roadside, holding a long pole and observing me intently. I walked toward him, and he stared at me for an extended period. I could only imagine what must have been going through his mind. Here was an American, clad in an army shirt and carrying an army backpack, walking across his rice paddy at the base of the hillside that had once been a fire base. His initial thoughts might have revolved around the idea that I was some American who had been hiding out in the jungle for the past 15 years. I greeted him with a friendly good morning in Vietnamese, and he nodded in acknowledgement. I continued down the road, with the farmer trailing behind me. Finally, I spotted my van approaching, so I paused and waited. Mr. Heap engaged in conversation with the farmer, who continued to glance at me and shake his head, muttering something that Mr. Heap later revealed was a reference to the crazy American. The farmer had believed I was a ghost, a deceased American soldier emerging from the hillside, endeavoring to find his way home. With Janet not being in the van, I took the opportunity to take off my shirt and retrieve my shaving kit. I proceeded to rid my face of the stubble that had accumulated from the previous day. I've always preferred to have my morning bathroom routine, including showering and shaving, completed before the woman woke up. Heap asked if I wanted to return to Tam Kai since Janet had reserved a room for me to freshen up, shower, and have breakfast. I said no, but we headed back to the hotel where I took another shower, shaved in Janet's room, and then joined the others. Then the four of us resumed our journey, traveling another 20 kilometers. In the early afternoon, we reached the site of a jet crash that had occurred late in the war. I found it puzzling why they couldn't locate this crash site back in the 1970s. It seemed to be the easy one to find. It wasn't far off the main road. A local farmer said he thought they had buried an American pilot. I wasn't sent here to search for remains. Another team did that. My mission was just to locate a downed aircraft and get a soil sample. I thought it might be a feather in my hat if I gave the GPS location for a body. So following the farmer with machete in hand, he cut a wider path for Janet, Mr. Heap, and myself to navigate. The distance was much greater than I thought, and I'm starting to think about turning around going back when I stumble on something in the pathway. I looked down and found there was a set of railroad tracks in this jungle. How did they get here? Why was it abandoned? I asked. The farmer pointed his machete in the direction of the track and said nothing and kept walking. I took a photo of it and kept walking until we came to a hole in the ground surrounded by trees and shrubs. I marked it on my GPS and took another soil sample. I asked if the body had been removed. The farmer said he did not know, only that he was told that was where the pilot was buried. I gave him a month's wages, and we went back to the van. This would not be the first time I would find railroad tracks in a jungle location and wonder what was here back in the days of the French. We continued driving until we reached a cluster of houses, and the woman who lived there kindly prepared an early lunch for Heap and the driver. My group realized that I didn't always want to stop for meals. While Mr. Heap reminded me he and driver needed to grab their lunch while he could still make a small profit. However, Janet intervened, suggesting that the meal didn't cost that much, and the old woman had been instructed to add $1 or more for Mr. Heap. Janet was careful not to embarrass Mr. Heap or make him lose face, but she wanted me to know that he often added extra charges for our meals. I acknowledged that I was aware of this and that I will deduct it when settling our accounts. In this makeshift roadside cafe, a conversation began between an old woman and the younger man, with her asking if I was a tourist and why was I looking for American aircraft. I asked how they knew this, but they remained silent. Either Mr. Heap or the driver had talked. I said I was looking for souvenirs from aircraft and not in search of MIA pilots. They explained that they didn't live in this area during the war, and they didn't know anyone who might be familiar with the crash site I was looking for. What I thought was going to be easy was turned out to be an all-day experience. There was a small village up this dirt road to the right, and we thought someone there might have information about the crash site. We ventured up a road clearly intended for motorcycles. After a short distance, we arrived at a cluster of 4 grass-roofed houses. A young boy was dispatched to find an older man who might be able to assist me. Soon, an elderly man and 3 younger men holding machetes emerged, wearing stern expressions. They were informed about my quest, but initially, they claimed not to know anything. In an attempt to show my appreciation, I handed the oldest man $5 in Vietnamese currency, and he expressed his gratitude. As we were preparing to leave, he stopped us and indicated that he might be able to show me something after all. We loaded all these men into the van and drove back onto the road. They explained that indeed there had been a plane crash, but it was not where I initially believed it to be. Instead, it was on the other side of the road and further down the road from the given longitude and latitude coordinates I was given. We arrived at the new location, and these 2 men began cutting a path through the dense jungle. No wonder they could find it back in 1970. You would need bulldozers to cut a path back in this wilderness. It was a time-consuming process, and by the early afternoon, just after 2 p.m., we had finally reached the cockpit of a jet that was still in relatively good condition. There seemed to be an intact bomb or possibly a fuel tank on one of the wings. I climbed up to take some photographs, but it was apparent that all the gauges inside the cockpit had been removed. I marked the location using my GPS, collected a soil sample, and then we returned to the main road. As a token of my appreciation, I gave each man 10 Vietnamese dollars, and they expressed their gratitude once more. It was brought to my attention that someone had been in this area recently, evidenced by another trail leading in from the west. Curious, I decided to follow this trail for a while, although Mr. Heap reminded me of the potential presence of tigers and other wild animals, and I had nothing more than a walking stick for protection. Janet and I were both drenched in sweat, and she playfully winked at me, asking if I had enjoyed myself trampling through this jungle. She went on to explain that the U.S. government pays the Vietnamese government millions of dollars to locate these downed aircraft, and she was curious about my motivations for doing this. I replied that I believed it was because the Vietnamese government tends to keep the money for themselves, even though they are supposed to compensate local villagers for their assistance in finding these sites. Additionally, I mentioned the significant pressure exerted on our government by organizations like the National League of POW, Mia families and others, all seeking answers and closure. I was informed by a local villager about another site where a helicopter had crashed, so Mr. Heap, Janet, and I, along with 3 local men with machetes cutting a pathway, set off down a different path. After a while, we gave up and returned to the van, where the driver said there is a path over there to his right. A villager who had just emerged from the path and said there was a plane that crashed just up the pathway. I speculated that this crash site might have been a rescue helicopter dispatched to assist the downed jet, and I were going to investigate the site to find out. Later in my after-action report, I was told to stick to the program and not go in search of downed aircraft. This wasn't originally on my list of locations to investigate, but I decided to take a look as it might uncover an unsolved mystery. As I traveled, sometime I would say I was looking for souvenirs out in the jungle. Doing this, I found some villagers would direct me to a location. I can't explain why I wanted to venture down this path, but I did. Big mistake. Now I just have one farmer who led the way. We found a path that was being used, as you could see motorcycle tracks. We walked down this path until we came upon a man who suddenly appeared on this trail with a Honda motorbike. Then another man joined him, brandishing an AK-47 and waving it angrily in the air. The one on the motorbike seemed furious that we were on his property, and upon learning I was Canadian, accused me of being an American responsible for his brother's death. I told them I heard there was an aircraft down this path, and I was trying to find and purchase aircraft instruments because I was a collector. The other claimed his father had shot down the aircraft. Then another man on a motorbike joined him. I suspected they saw Janet and I as possibly tourists, and they being bandits thought we'd be easy prey. So here we were, about half a kilometer from our van and 30 or 40 kilometers from the nearest major village, and this guy had his gun pointed at us. The local man and Mr. Heap turned and walked away rapidly, disappearing from sight, probably running to save their own lives. There was no loyalty among them. The man with the AK could speak English and demanded to know what we were doing. I explained again that we had heard about a plane crash in this area, and I was searching for aircraft souvenirs. He claimed that his father had shot down the airplane in the woods behind him, and therefore the aircraft belonged to him. I glanced around, unsure if Janet and I could outrun a bullet. Janet suggested offering him some money to buy souvenirs. He understood some English, so with Janet translating, we expressed our apologies and asked if he would be willing to sell some of the aircraft gauges. I pulled out a wad of Vietnamese bills. Money speaks volumes, and I offered to buy an altimeter for 20 Vietnamese dollars. Initially, it seemed like he was going to fetch some gauges from his home, but then he changed his mind. He demanded more money and pointed toward Janet and said something to the other man. The other man approached Janet from behind, grabbing her arm. With lightning speed, she spun around, delivering a powerful kick to the man's groin, holding her arm, then another to his head, sending him staggering backward. In a swift motion, she then hurled him into the man with the rifle, knocking them both off their feet and causing the rifle to clatter to the ground. Janet swiftly picked up the AK-47, pointing it menacingly at the two startled men, all while effortlessly lifting the Honda 50 motorcycle. She motioned for me to hop onto the back of the Honda, and we sped away down the trail we had come from. Janet turned to me and quipped, "You weren't much help back there." Trying to find a humorous response, I retorted, "Well, I work a lot better if I have hand grenades I can throw over my shoulder, just like in the war when tigers were chasing me." She half turned to look at me, a hint of concern in her eyes, thinking I was serious. "What tiger was that?" she asked. I grinned and replied, maybe it was in my dream, and in reality I was being chased by a jealous husband. "I don't know, I'm just looking for something funny to say." The two bandits followed us back to the van, their anger palpable. As soon as we reached the van, the farmer had vanished, and Mr. Heap had the van turned around. Janet swiftly pulled a rubber hose from the side of the Honda and pushed it into the weeds. She then removed the lone bullet from the rifle, tossing it into the underbrush. A bit further down the road, she discarded the AK-47. We were getting out of there at lightning speed, hoping they wouldn't follow us. The driver was clearly upset, expressing his displeasure at my quest for aircraft souvenirs and the trouble it might bring him. A short distance down the road, Janet threw out the magazine from the AK-47. We all sat in stunned silence for a moment, in awe of Janet's remarkable composure during that intense situation. She turns to look at me and says, "Tigers, really, Mr. Bond." She was no ordinary 30-year-old woman, and she possessed extensive training and an extraordinary calmness under pressure. I think I was a little more in shock than she was. I got the impression from her this was just normal everyday experience for her. She mentioned having a black belt in karate, which led me to believe she might have had military or law enforcement experience, perhaps even CIA. I couldn't help but ask, "Who are you?" I knew she was someone other than just an advisor in Vietnamese customs. She just smiled and replied, "I am woman, you know, like Helen Reddy, and you, Mr. Bond. You're a 00 agent with someone's husband chasing you in the jungle." I admire this woman, and while I've never been in a bar fight myself, I can imagine feeling utterly safe with her by my side. She appears to me to be the kind of person who could clear out an entire bar with a stern look and then casually walk up to the counter and order a bottle of red wine stirred with a twist of sangria and not shaken. I love this woman, and maybe now I might even fear her. She is fast and quick with a kick and punch. I kept asking myself, who is this woman who could so coolly take off someone's head? Although she didn't know that AK only had one round, she remained cool, while if it were me I would have easily shot both of them in the back of the head if they were threatening us, and I was able to get the drop on them as she had just done. I felt incredibly lucky to have her on my side. During the Vietnam War there was rarely a day that went by when I was not scared, but now, in 1990, it was total different. I've been through a series of training programs that built your confidence, and all those congratulations certificates they have been giving me the last 15 years indicating I could do anything, and then here I was believing them. Mr. Heap asked me about her identity, and I jokingly replied, "She's Mrs. James Bond," but he didn't quite grasp the reference. We returned to the same government hotel in Da Nang. We decided to make a short drive out to the beach that was once known as China Beach, where we went for a swim, spending most of the day in the water. Janet mentioned hearing rumors of a new beach somewhere along the stretch, and I raised an eyebrow, curious about her intentions. She just smiled mysteriously. I inquired if she was interested in embarking on a search for it, and I made it clear that if she was up for it, so was I. In response, she gave me a classic look accompanied by a wink, leaving me somewhat puzzled, not knowing what that means. We rented an umbrella and some lawn chairs to shield ourselves from the sun while relishing the refreshing ocean breeze. Janet kept calling me Mr. Bond and even introduced me to others as Mr. James Bond. I found her playful teasing and laughter infectious, even when I cracked jokes that weren't particularly funny. We sipped on coconut drinks, and she inquired about my departure date. I told her I was leaving on December 24. Janet confided that her life in Saigon was dull and her boyfriend lacked a sense of adventure. She squeezed my hand gently and suggested we indulge in another spot treatment with wine and cheese. She remarked that I was different from other men, which triggered warning bells in my mind, as it sounded like a scripted move right out of the How to Win a Man's Heart playbook. Little did she know, I had read the same book. I tried to maintain a guarded outlook, resisting the urge to develop feelings for a woman I had just met. No matter what, I could never trust her or anyone in telling them everything. There's no profit in it to me, and I don't need to boost my ego for a woman's ears to hear. Janet playfully intertwined her feet with mine, gazing into my eyes for prolonged moments. She then proposed that we become a team, likening us to Cagney and Lacey, a TV series at the time which I had never seen. Her quick winks left me both amused and intrigued, hinting at possibilities that I couldn't ignore, even if I hadn't watched that particular series. On our way back to the hotel from the beach, we passed numerous roadside stalls selling handmade stone products, so we decided to stop and indulge in some shopping. We spent a good part of the evening exploring these shops, looking for unique pieces to take back with us. That night, we had plans to visit the spa once more. As we lay on the bed, Janet playfully draped her leg across mine, and we engaged in a conversation. I was eager to learn more about her, but she seemed hesitant to delve into her past. She did reveal that she had two brothers who were martial arts instructors, and she had picked up a few skills from them. She mentioned being a marksman with a rifle and having knowledge of handling an AK-47, which both of her brothers owned. At one point she playfully suggested going out and buying another set-off handcuff without a key. I said I could picture her handcuffing me spread eagle to the headboard and the foot of the bed and wearing some sexy attire, and then leaving saying she was going shopping and would be back in the morning. She asked me not to put thoughts in her head that maybe one day she might want to act out. She does scare me, and I keep asking myself, is this real or just a game she's playing? I keep remembering my training where you never trust anyone even if they're your best friend. I shared with Janet that a few years back, I had been a licensed dealer and manufacturer of automatic weapons. When she asked if there was good money in buying and selling guns, I explained that it wasn't particularly lucrative, but that there were thousands of collectors like myself. I mainly bought and sold to fellow collectors. Then Janet surprised me by inquiring if I knew how to make an RPG rocket launcher. I admitted that I did have experience making one, along with crafting a 2-mortar, a World War II-era bazooka, and even an M50 caliber machine gun. She responded, "Good, we might have to start carrying some heavy artillery." I'm uncertain about her true identity, but as long as she remains an ally, I'm content. I'm gradually developing a fondness for this woman, and I must ensure I never take any actions that might jeopardize our friendship. She started to open up, telling me that she was pregnant at 14, not 16, married the guy, and then divorced when she found her husband got another pregnant girl during the second month of their marriage. She joined the Marines and became an MP. I told her I had guessed she was an MP, I just never thought she would have joined the Marines. She said she had attended schools that were normally reserved for males, but she was a gifted student. I got the impression she used her femininity to get whatever she wanted. I noticed we had a lot of similarities in training. She said she loved living on the edge, something new with adventure, so she went to work for this company in the Philippines. I'm really shocked to find we both think alike, and she really is me in female form. I asked who she really worked for, and she said the same company as she told me before. That wasn't the answer I was hoping to get, but I let it end there. I told her I went through an intensive course on working with males and females who might be the enemy and might be trying to lure me into a trap. I suppose that was the primary reason I never allowed my heart and mind to be consumed by another. I'd play the game as long as I did not become the victim. She mentioned that she liked my little birthmark, and I was puzzled, asking her which birthmark she was referring to. She pointed out one near a certain private area and said it was up there near Mr. Happy. I chuckled and replied that I didn't have a birthmark there. She seemed determined and pulled out a wad of Vietnamese money, proposing a bet to prove her point. She suggested that I drop my pants and she would show me. I deflected the suggestion, told her to go to sleep, and turned over in the bed, stifling my laughter. She whispered the word chicken, which made it even harder to hold back my amusement. She makes me think about a girl from my youth, and I find sometimes thinking she's reincarnated of that girl or what I wish that girl would have been. It was a challenge to remain faithful, and while I had been warned about such situations, no one had taught me how to keep her Mr. Happy then on the farm. Years later, I would think about that moment once again, and I think when you're living on the razor edge, it's easy to fall in love with someone who is up there with you. The following morning, Janet mentioned that she was planning to take a plane back to Saigon. I asked if it was related to the previous night's conversation, and she assured me it wasn't. She explained that she had other means of satisfaction, and that her real reason for leaving was to avoid tempting me. She expressed her genuine fondness for me and her belief that I was a good man. She didn't want to continue putting temptation in my way, so she decided to leave. We drove her to the airport and waited outside to ensure she got her ticket. However, she surprised us by returning 10 minutes later, saying she had changed her mind. She climbed back in the van and gently slapped the upper part of my leg and said she was sorry I was just going to have to monitor my own behavior and not depend on her. She said this is the most exciting time of her life, and it wasn't going to end so abruptly at an airport like in Casablanca. She wasn't going home with Victor. She was going to stay with Mr. Bond and enjoy the adventure. Just keep Mr. Happy on your side of the bed, and she laughed. My first thought when I saw her come back out of the airport and climb in the van and tell me she was not going back to Saigon, that she had been advised to stay with me. It seemed like a better cover story if I were traveling with my wife. Janet reminded me that spies don't typically travel to third world countries with their wives. I had previously mentioned that our passports had different names, but she had a quick response, saying we had just recently married and were on our honeymoon. She hadn't changed her name yet, she claimed. She emphasized that I should forget all other details, as men didn't tend to remember such specifics. We meticulously went over the finer points to ensure our stories would align in case of any interrogations. It was evident that we had received similar training from the same sources. We found ourselves back on Highway 1, and I had a desire to stop at Hill 54 once more, hoping that this time the police wouldn't be present. Our next destination was Hill 54 and the village nestled below it. We made a left turn onto the hill where the artillery had once been stationed. However, the area seemed to have changed since my last visit. The hill that had appeared much taller in 1968 now looked as though it had shrunk, perhaps reduced to half its original size. I navigated the van toward the helipad, but it proved challenging with a body of water blocking our path. Like all the other places I had revisited, everything had vanished, as if these sites had erased their history, showing no sign of their past existence. The terrain appeared altered, almost as if a landslide had rearranged the landscape. As usual, the moment I stepped out of the van, a crowd of people gathered around me, following me like I was some kind of two-headed alien. I retrieved my backpack, took out the photo of Linda Koo, and displayed it to the curious onlookers. At first, no one recognized her until an older woman asked to see the photo. She beckoned Mr. Heap over to the side, while others who spoke English began engaging in conversation with me. I was pleasantly surprised by how many people in Vietnam were still proficient in the English language. Mr. Heap returned, his words carrying the weight of sorrow. The old woman remembered Lena, but informed us that she had been killed after 1975. The moment he mentioned her death, a tear welled up in my eye, and nothing else seemed to matter. I refused to engage in conversation with anyone else, retreating to the van and signaling for us to leave. I found a seat beside Janet, and the old woman with her bag of vegetables joined us, wanting to be driven back to her house. Unbeknownst to me, Mr. Land was also present, already seated in the front passenger seat of the van, engaging in conversation with Janet. When he greeted me by name, I was taken aback, but I exchanged pleasantries and quickly recounted the story of Linda Koo. He noticed Janet and raised an eyebrow, insinuating a romantic connection. I clarified that she was just a friend I had met in Da Nang and there was no need to divulge everything to him. Mr. Land responded with a sly grin and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. As the van came to a stop in a village, the old woman informed us that Linda's mother lived a short walk down the road. Mr. Heap, seated beside the old woman, conveyed her suggestion that I visit Linda's mother. Initially, I declined, but then I changed my mind, perhaps seeking some closure. Janet, understanding my mood, agreed to stay in the van. I gave her some Vietnamese money and asked her to buy a bottle of red wine. She accepted the money and left the van, heading to a nearby roadside vendor to make the purchase while I prepared to face Linda's mother. We made our way along a jungle path for about 400 feet, with a throng of curious villagers trailing behind us. As we walked, I inquired about how Linda had been killed, and the old woman's eyes welled up with tears. Mr. Land walked alongside the old lady, translating her responses for me. Meanwhile, Mr. Heap seemed perturbed, perhaps realizing that his lucrative job was in jeopardy, and he hastened his pace, walking on the opposite side of the old woman from Mr. Land. It was satisfying to witness this development. Now, he understood the potential consequences of his actions. I had a feeling that I could trust Mr. Land a little more than Heap, though I didn't fully trust either of them. As we walked, the old lady led the way, with Mr. Land on one side of her and Mr. Heap on the other. I followed closely behind them, with a crowd of 20 to 30 curious villagers trailing behind us. It was a lengthy walk, and the old woman was talking animatedly. Then, suddenly Mr. Land stopped, turned around, and motioned for me to do the same. He had a crucial story to relay, one that the old woman had shared with him. She recounted how, after 1975, the Viet Cong VC had arrived in the area, bringing with them a wave of horrors. People would vanish overnight, never to be seen again. She revealed that the village chief, Mr. Lone, had provided the VC with a list of names, claiming that these individuals had assisted the Americans in killing VC soldiers. Mr. Lone was trying to curry favor with the VC. Both Mr. Heap and Mr. Land spoke at once to emphasize that young girls whose names appeared on this list were marked for death by the VC. These girls were essentially forced into becoming overnight companions for the VC soldiers, as refusing them meant certain death, a fate they had witnessed befall others before. Many people in the village did whatever it took to survive during those harrowing times. Some opted to flee and live with distant relatives in different cities, avoiding the perilous countryside altogether. The old woman continued, sharing more details about Linda's tragic story. She revealed that Linda had lived just a few houses away from her, a short distance south of the city of Tam Kai. Tam Kai was now within easy reach, just up the modern-day road from our current location. The old woman recounted a dreadful night when the VC descended upon Linda's home. She described how, during the dark hours, she had heard a woman, Linda, also known as Koo, screaming and pleading for mercy. It was as if someone was subjecting her to a severe beating. During those times, when the VC came at night and you heard screams, you simply stayed in your bed, praying they wouldn't come for you. In the rural areas and small villages, former South Vietnamese soldiers lived in constant fear of the VC's nocturnal visits. They would stealthily leave their homes at night, returning only when daylight broke to tend to their farms. During these mornings, they would huddle together, sharing stories of how fellow men had disappeared or met their fate the previous night. The old woman continued her grim tale, recounting how, one fateful morning, a crowd had gathered around Linda's modest stick house. She had walked down the street, compelled to discover what had transpired. The gruesome scene that met her eyes was etched in her memory forever. Linda's lifeless body hung from a tree, stripped of her clothes, her hands bound behind her back and a noose around her neck suspending her from a branch. Her belly had been brutally slashed open, its contents spilling out onto the ground. Villagers had to chase away the pigs that were devouring her remains. Heartlessly, the VC soldiers present had admonished the onlookers not to interfere with the pigs, asserting that they, too, needed to eat. Linda's lifeless form bore a sign around her neck, accusing her of fraternizing with the Americans. Horrified, I halted in my tracks, expressing reluctance to visit Linda's mother, fearing that I might have been indirectly responsible for Koo's death. Both Mr. Land and Mr. Heap insisted that I must proceed. They emphasized that these villagers would inform Linda's mother that an American had come to visit but had second thoughts. Reluctantly, I agreed to continue, understanding that it would be a loss of face if I turned back now after coming so far. With a heavy heart, I followed them down a narrow path, just wide enough for a bicycle to pass through. When we arrived at Linda's mother's residence, she was diligently sweeping away dirt and fallen leaves from the front of her grass and bamboo dwelling. Mr. Land introduced me, and the elderly woman inquired if I were Michael. I affirmed this, as it was a middle name I had adopted during the war to obscure my true identity while engaged in black market activities back in '68 and '69. Upon hearing this, tears welled up in her eyes, flowing like a torrential river. I found it unbearable to remain there any longer. Both men had been recounting the story simultaneously, and I requested that only one person, Mr. Land, continue. Turning away, I walked back to the van. The old woman offered to guide me to her daughter's burial site, but I declined, unable to bear the weight of that moment. As we returned to where the van was parked, the elderly woman gestured towards Mr. Lone's house. We drove past the dwelling, and I etched a mental image of it in my memory. I noticed a cafe just a few doors up the street, so we stopped there for dinner with the driver, Heap Land, Janet, and myself. Janet observed my distress, but chose to remain silent. Inside, there was a black Amerasian girl working as a servant, diligently cleaning the floor. I was told that people considered her ugly and had even thrown rocks at her. I walked over to her, enveloping her in my arms, which startled her at first. I kissed her forehead and told her that I thought she was beautiful. When my words were translated for her, it brought a tearful smile to her face. I gestured for her to sit beside Janet and me, but Janet graciously gave up her seat for the young girl. I instructed Mr. Land to convey to her that she could order any food she desired. However, Mr. Land explained that she was essentially a servant, akin to a modern-day slave, having been sold by her mother to make her mother's life easier. With Mr. Land's translation, I asked the girl if she would like to go to America, and she replied with a smile and a heartfelt yes. I vowed, as God is my witness, I'll do whatever it takes to make that wish come true. Janet, with a quivering voice, tilted her head slightly as though on the verge of tears, and whispered, "You're a good man, Mr. Bond." Mr. Land explained that the girl had no mother, only the woman who owned the restaurant had purchased her when she was just an infant. I requested Mr. Land to obtain the girl's name, address, and age so that I could contact the ODP Bangkok office for assistance. During our conversation, the girl's owner intervened, stating that she would require payment if the girl were to leave, demanding $1,000 in U.S. currency. I agreed to this condition, but made it clear that I would pay once all the necessary paperwork was in order and the girl had a confirmed seat on a plane. Turning to the girl, I inquired about her meal preference. She glanced at her owner for approval, which was granted. The girl then shyly expressed her desire for a particular dish, causing her owner to chuckle before leaving the dining area. Mr. Land mentioned that he lived nearby and would keep an eye on her. No. Upon my return to the U.S., I contacted the St. Louis Institute on Grand Ave in St. Louis and requested their assistance. It would be a few years before she could leave Vietnam, but during that time, she became well known, and a Vietnamese boy married her, likely as a means to eventually bring him and his rich family to America. I was informed that they settled in Houston, Texas. During our time together, I captured photos of us using my camera. Janet, however, declined to be in any photos, so she took pictures of me with my camera, retained the film, and later returned the photos to me after cutting up the negative strips of those pictures that included her. Janet began to share insights into Vietnamese customs with me. She explained that, in general, young girls in Vietnam are cautious about being touched by boys. When they walk to school, they carry their books in front of them, fearing that a boy might touch them on their breasts, leading to a potential pregnancy. If a boy sees a girl bathing or in a state of undress, he is obligated to marry her. Additionally, many marriages in Vietnam are prearranged when the girl is in her early teens. Families often arrange these unions, with the two fathers engaging in discussions that may involve exchanging money or rice. Then, a few days later, the girl's mother informs her daughter that she will marry a certain boy. Janet clarified that these customs are more prevalent in the rural areas and less common in the cities of Vietnam. Despite having dinner at the cafe, my appetite was non-existent. My mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Lena and the village chief, Mr. Lone. A seething anger was building inside me, and I could feel it approaching an uncontrollable rage. There had been moments in my life where temporary insanity had taken over, resulting in actions I would never have otherwise taken had I been in a rational state of mind. In a burst of emotion, I stood up on the seat of the picnic table and passionately recounted the story of Lena and Mr. Lone, declaring that I would offer a reward of $1,000 in U.S. dollars to anyone who would kill Mr. Lone. Everyone in the cafe immediately stood up in response to my outburst, and Janet placed her hand on my arm, urging me to sit down and cautioning me about the gravity of my actions. Heap and Mr. Land swiftly intervened, grabbing me and forcefully guiding me back outside to the van. We drove away from the cafe, and Janet, curious about what had transpired during my visit to Linda's mother, inquired. Mr. Land proceeded to fill her in on the situation. Mr. Land, who lived in the area and was well known, emphasized the potential repercussions my actions could have on him and his family. Meanwhile, Mr. Heap reiterated that if I were to repeat such behavior, I would need to find a different interpreter for our journey. We drove a short distance and checked into a hotel for the night. The beds in the hotel room were designed for either a single person or two small individuals, so I slept alone in a small room. I found it difficult to sleep due to the stifling heat in the room. The small fan in the room wasn't working effectively, and I was drenched in sweat. Seeking relief, I went outside and sat down in a lawn chair. The cool breeze provided some comfort to my perspiring body, and I must have drifted off to sleep. I was abruptly awakened by the wailing siren of a police car. Janet was standing beside me, concerned and questioning if I was all right, as she noticed I was drenched in sweat as though I'd been running. I explained that the room had been unbearably hot, prompting me to come outside to cool down. Perplexed, she asked why I hadn't used the air conditioner. I replied that my room didn't have one. She assured me that it did, and we returned to my room, where she located the switch and pulled back the drapes to reveal. We returned to the front of the hotel and sat in the lawn chairs. In the moonlight, we watched what appeared to be a fire down near the place we had eaten at earlier. Janet asked me if I ever killed anyone outside of the war. I said no, never directly, but I would have a problem doing it if the crime justified it. You mean like Mr. Lone, the man who murdered your Vietnamese girlfriend, Linda. You would pay someone else to kill someone for you, wouldn't you? Absolutely in a heartbeat, I said, but my training was to plan it out, then thoroughly execute it to make it appear the dog was the one who really did it. Place the blame on someone who is equally guilty. I'm learning from you, Mr. Bond. And if you don't have time to plan it out like what just happened, then what? You just do it and create a story later. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going. Janet and I sat beside each other, and as daylight approached, Mr. Heap and the driver joined us, leaving a vacant seat between us. They noticed we wanted to be left alone, so they got up and went elsewhere, and we continued to talk. I asked Janet what she thinking, and she said something I had told me before in the hotel. Michael, you told me your first love married a man and someone killed him and left his body in your backyard. Did you do that? I was shocked she would ask me that question. Janet, if I did do it, I would never tell you, and beside his crime against me would have been minor. His crime could have been taken care of with a baseball bat to his kneecaps. This whole story was a mystery to me. My brother and vet friend had been there that last night he was alive, and I often wondered about it. I asked my brother, but he would always say he forgot or didn't remember the things I remembered. I remember he had returned from the Navy in the early 1960s and had joined some military organization, and then later in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis he came in the house holding an unusual gun, saying he was going to be gone for a while. I don't know what happened, but nothing ever came of it. Years later I asked him, and as always he would say he didn't remember. Excuse me, Michael, but I don't think I believe you. I read your Vietnam military file. You seem to have been in places where people have died, and you've walked away with leaving only a story and unsolved mystery. You read my military file. How did you get access to that? She didn't answer, but I said, Janet, I would have to be stupid to have left someone's body in my backyard. I'm not stupid, Janet. Your brother and your friend Jason were both there on his last night he was alive, and you don't think they did this for you. Where are you getting all of this information? From you, she said. And then she went on to say, what about the war when the Jew kid was bragging about the murdering all those sailor on the USS Liberty in 67? You didn't kill him. Now I upset, and I asked where is she getting all this information. Yes, I said I would have cherished the thought that he died because of me. Keep this polite and with no anger, but tell me, Janet, you seem to know a lot about me. Have you ever killed anyone, Janet? Yes, I have, she said 3 times, and by myself, and I take full credit for it. I had a daughter out of wedlock, and the father came to the house and kidnapped my child. He died in an automobile accident. The second man I was with was an alcoholic, and he beat my infant daughter. He will never touch a child again. The third one, I'm going to keep that story to myself. I was sweating before now, and I was drenched. How did she know all of these things? The only place she could have possibly found them was in my journal or from a personal interview I had when I first entered as an agent. She could only have gotten this information from my own handlers. I've been honest with you, Janet said. Now be honest with me. Have you ever killed anyone outside of your time as a soldier in Vietnam? I said no, and I think it's best if we never talk about these things again. You know, they trained us to 5 different ways to terminate someone's life without using a gun or a knife. I agree with you, Janet said. It best we don't ever speak of these things again. It best to keep all these stories to ourselves. In nobody's business but ours. Back there in the jungle, would you have killed those 2 men if you had to? Janet asked. If I had to, yes, our lives were being threatened. It would have been either us or them, and I would make it appear the dog had done it. Janet laughed and said thanks. Back during the war, it was easy to kill someone with extreme prejudice. She said to stop, but I continued my story and said after I returned from the war I purchased a Smith 44 Mag 6 shooter for personal protection. Then one night an older woman who had escaped from a mental hospital, which I was unaware of at the time, was breaking in the back of my parents' home. When awakened from sleep, I ran and got my father's shotgun, and he stopped me, asked what I was going to do with it, and I said I don't have a problem killing someone. I shocked the hell out of him and my mother. On another night when there was gas rationing in 1970, a man threatened my father's life because he felt he had going in front of him in the gas line, and I carried that handgun up to the end of the street to if that same guy wanted to have an altercation with me. My father stopped me, saying the guy was already gone. Both times I scared my father, and later in both cases I glad nothing happened. I learned from my new employer to always be polite, never show anger, make it appear that I'm friendly to the enemy, and then wait a year, 2 years to calm down, and when the dust had settled, then let the dog do it. I remembered great Vietnam vet friend Jesse, who came back home from the war, and some guy had date raped his sister, and he took part of his head off and got 20 years. That would never happen with me. I'm not going to do anything that does not justly the crime. There were a lot of guys who had no trouble killing someone when they returned from that war. We talked a good part of the next day, and I was glad she had a more level head than I did, although I think she had the ability to take care of a problem and walk away like it was just another day. I was glad we had this discussion. When I first joined the GSP, I was interviewed over a couple days, and they wanted to know everything about me. I gave up a lot of secrets involving individuals that I wished I had taken care of in my life. I thought in giving this information they might view me as a man who, if encountering a problem, would be willing to take whatever necessary actions necessary to safeguard my country. I never realized they wrote all these things down. Of course, I was always innocent, but at telling the story, I always left the final results or interpretation up to the interviewer to finish the story in his own mind. So Janet must work for the same organization, otherwise she would never have known all these stories I told in order to get this job. The sun had arrived, and both Mr. Heap and Mr. Land and driver were in waiting for our departure. Mr. Land said there was a fire down the road near the place where we had eaten. Janet says maybe they were cleaning out some rats. Mr. Land requested assistance with his immigration paperwork for the United States, citing his past work for the Americans during his time as an interpreter, particularly with the U.S. Marines. I agreed to help him to the best of my ability. Mr. Land had previously worked with my unit, the 198th Infantry, during the war, although my interactions with him had been limited to that time. A more detailed account of this story can be found in my wartime journal titled The Land of the Midnight Scream. I appreciated Mr. Land's discretion regarding my activities, as he knew how to keep sensitive matters confidential. In contrast, Mr. Heap's curiosity led him to inquire about everything and everyone I associated with. Mr. Land said he would tell me more when we reached Saigon. We continued our journey along Highway 1 toward Saigon, and I mentioned that I had many female friends in the vicinity of Nuc Mo village. I expressed a desire to look for them if time allowed. I showed Mr. Land and Mr. Heap some photos I had of these friends. Mr. Land, who had been known as Sergeant Tom during the war, informed me that he knew some of these people and would assist in locating them. He also mentioned that one of the girls named Sandy had an American baby, with the name of Sandy tattooed on her arm. I confirmed my familiarity with Sandy. Somewhere along the way, Mr. Heap seemed to misconstrue my intentions, thinking that these were all former girlfriends and that I might be trying to find abandoned children. After my departure from Vietnam in 1990, it appeared that Mr. Heap had found a new way to earn money. I suspect he placed an advertisement in a Vietnamese newspaper falsely indicating that I had returned to Vietnam in search of my lost children. In exchange for a fee, he promised to provide interested parties with my contact information. Once back home, I began receiving letters from Vietnamese women who claimed to be waiting for my return with our child. While we were driving south, Janet inquired if I had ever visited Gia Long Waterfall. I admitted that I hadn't, but I had heard about it. She suggested we make a stop, and I agreed, so we changed course and headed for the waterfall. It turned out to be a beautiful place with numerous cascades, reminiscent of a location I'd seen in Jamaica, though Gia Long was even more impressive. We located a small hotel nearby and decided to stay the night. Janet was eager to go for a swim, so we went shopping and found some swimwear. As we walked to one of the waterfalls, she mentioned that this was the perfect spot for skinny dipping, making me question why we'd even bothered buying swim clothes. Despite my initial reluctance, we left our clothes on a large rock and swam under the waterfall, enjoying the experience. I was relieved that Mr. Heap and Mr. Len were occupied, presumably with other pursuits. Throughout my life, I had maintained fidelity to my wife and had never been unfaithful in a sexual manner. However, the temptation was certainly present during this encounter, and my body was responding to the desire. As a soldier, I had spent time in tents and hotels with female colleagues, but we had always maintained our modesty. The most challenging part of the situation arose when we emerged from the water to retrieve our towels and clothing. At that moment, we both noticed each other's bodies, and there were no longer any secrets. She may have also discovered that I didn't possess the birthmark she initially claimed I had. I was struggling to control my physical response, and Janet, noticing my embarrassment, reassured me, saying that it happens to everyone. As we strolled toward the spot where we had left our bathing suits, we discovered they were missing, with only by 2 small towels left behind. Ahead of us stood a group of children, all likely under the age of 10, holding our clothes and extending their hands, clearly expecting some money. Only one of them spoke English, and he conveyed that the children wanted $10 in exchange for our swimwear. I explained that I didn't have $10, but assured them I would pay the little extortionist when we returned to the hotel. However, they adamantly refused and insisted on following us back. Now, shrouded in darkness, we had to navigate the path back to the hotel, attempting to stay in the shadows. They even withheld our shoes. The distance from the hotel to the waterfall seemed almost half a football field, and the rocky terrain made the journey challenging, especially without shoes. Despite the predicament, Janet found the whole situation hilarious. Eventually, we found a sandy area to walk on, and the distant sound of music from the hotel reached our ears. Janet seized my arm, spun me around, and expressed her love for the song playing. In a whimsical moment, she suggested dancing, and I remarked on the impracticality of dancing in the nude with just 2 small towels. Undeterred, she agreed, and she took me in her arms, and we embraced, dancing in the wet sand to Richard Marx's Right Here, Waiting for You. Her head was against my shoulder, and I could feel her breast against me as she tried to draw me closer toward her. Suddenly, someone shouted at the kids, prompting them to throw our swimsuits at us, before swiftly taking off running. At the end of the song, Janet passionately kissed me. She made some remark of which I have forgotten, but it was something about Mr. Happy standing up between us. We dressed, and later, as we walked down the hotel corridor, I spotted Mr. Heapwood, a young girl, in a room separated by a cloth curtain door. A few doors down, Mr. Land was in a room with 2 girls, also separated by a cloth curtain. I had discreetly given Mr. Land $20 and requested that he not inform Mr. Heap about it. When Mr. Land noticed me, he got up and asked if I needed anything. I replied that I had everything I needed as I very gently tapped Janet's buttocks and then said I would see him in the morning. When we made it back to the room, she opened the window on the 2nd floor, allowing the summer warmth to enter the room. We could hear music playing from the cafe next door, and Janet said dance with me. She made a humorous comment about Mr. Happy, but I've forgotten. I tell Janet I have a very romantic heart, and I'm a man who loves to express my feeling in words rather than hold them in, and she said she know that, and that is what she loves about me. In the early morning hours, Janet was up, and she said she purchased a cassette tape for me. I played the music in the van. It was songs by Mary MacGregor where she sang Torn Between Two Lovers. Then when the song came on the radio, tape player singing, Janet said the song reminded her of us. So we journeyed together. She rested her head on my shoulder, and when I inquired, she simply replied, I'm just dreaming. It's not uncommon for a man or woman to share exciting moments and develop feelings for each other over a short span of time, and the music playing at that moment, and most of the music playing was from that tape, and all the songs seems to have the same theme. I had to buy the same tape later in the day. In my younger days, I referred to this as the fleeting sensation of puppy love. Though I can't recall the exact term used for the causes of puppy love, I understand that there's a chemical reaction in the body that triggers this feeling, which typically lasts only a few days or months before returning to normal. It's akin to the early days of marriage, where the initial spark fades unless both partners actively work at keeping it alive, striving to win each other's hearts anew every day for the rest of their lives. Falling in love is simple, but maintaining that love requires dedication and effort. In my own experience, the puppy love phase lasted for 7 years, and then 30 years later, it resurfaced for another 12 years with the same person. It's achievable if both parties recognize it and commit to sustaining it, never allowing a day to pass without treating each other as if it were their first date and preserving that cherished feeling of making the other happy you are at their side. The following day, we were en route to NHA Trang. However, we hadn't gone far when we experienced a flat tire, and the spare had very little air. No one around, so the driver promptly removed the flat tire and waited until a Honda passed us on the road. He hired a Honda OM, an individual on a Honda who would take passengers to their desired destinations for a fee. Janet, Mr. Land, and I walked a short distance to an open-air cafe while Mr. Heap stayed with the van to prevent theft. The cafe had once been a South Vietnamese headquarters surrounded by barbed wire. They only served 33 beers, and due to the heat, we had to drink them with ice in tin cups. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Heap joined us since he could still watch the van from the cafe. 2 motorcycles approached our van. 2 men got off and began looking around the van for us. Mr. Heap got up and walked to the van to see what these men wanted. A little while later, the 2 men carrying backpacks entered the cafe and looked at me, then talked to the owner before coming over to our table. They came over to us and took the table alongside, and they began asking questions of Mr. Heap. My land said there are policemen, and they want to know why an American was out on this road. They asked if they could see me travel documents, and I told Mr. Heap that I had mistakenly left it in my hotel in Saigon. One of the 2 men left, returning toward the hotel in Geelong, while the other stayed with us. I'm not sure of all the questions being asked, but it dealt with where we had traveled and stopped, who we had seen, and the purpose of our travel to Geelong. This man, who was doing the entire talking, name was Mr. Kai. Mr. Land let Heap do all the talking. We were required to show our passports, which he wrote down in his information book. He wrote down the name and address of Janet's employer in Saigon and her boss name. All of his questions about the 2 of Americans were asked through Mr. Heap, who seemed extremely upset. Janet said she did not understand all of his questions, but he wanted to learn as much as possible about us. He pulled out a camera and took a photo of Janet and I sitting at the table. After an hour, the driver returned with a replacement tire. Mr. Kai questioned him, and then we resumed our journey. Mr. Land said Mr. Kai was not a nice man, and Mr. Heap left and agreed. Eventually, we arrived in the stunning coastal city of Nha Trang. Janet and I shared a room, and as it began to rain, she suggested we take a ride in a cyclo. Cyclos were 3-wheel bike taxis with room for 2 passengers in the front seat, positioned over 2 bike tires. The driver sat behind, pedaling the bike. In case of rain, the driver could put up the convertible top and pull down the side curtains, which had plastic windows for us to see through. We found a cyclo driver who had a rain cover, and we climbed in, asking the driver for a 1-hour ride around the city during the rainstorm. It turned out to be a very romantic experience. Janet snuggled up next to me, slipping her hand under my shirt to feel the warmth of my body. She asked me if I smoked, to which I replied no. She mentioned that she had seen me with a pack of Chesterfield cigarettes a couple of times in my front pocket. I chuckled and explained that it wasn't cigarettes but a voice recorder cleverly disguised as a pack of smokes. I decided to confide in her about using voice recorders to document conversations for my after-action reports. Curious, she inquired whether I had recorded her voice, to which I replied that it was possible at times. She then asked if it was currently recording, and I assured her that it was voice-activated. With a mischievous glint in her eye, she suggested talking seductively, but I insisted on turning it off first, I only pretending to do so. I knew then we were both experiencing that puppy love feeling, but we would be departing very soon back to our own individual world, and it would just become a moment in our lives when once again we felt alive and young. Janet's irresistibly seductive way of speaking had a captivating charm, almost capable of resurrecting Lazarus from the dead 20 years after his death. The allure was such that I could envision being happily married to her, never wanting to leave for work. Many years later, I learned she had many men in her life. I see nothing wrong with that if only she was looking for the best partner in her life and not just a moment. She has a slight Australian accent that is so seductive, and it reminded me in a different way, but still has the same effect as the voice on My First Love. When she would say my first name or even calling me Mr. Bond, it would throw shivers of affection down my body. This woman had a way of throwing feeling down the length of my body that had only occurred in my teenage years. I loved this feeling. I made her aware of what she was doing to me, and she said she was just being herself and not trying to do anything. She said she loved that I had that effect upon her. During our cycle ride, the driver, who was clad in rain gear, occasionally stopped beneath trees to take shelter from the rain. Janet had taken to calling me Mr. Bond, reminiscing about a previous encounter, but noting that this experience was unlike any other. She expressed how much she would miss me once I left. I reciprocated the sentiment and suggested stopping to get a bottle of her favorite red wine. However, she declined, stating that she wanted to sit beside me all night in the rain and raise the flagpole, causing me to laugh, wanting to give her a gentle slap to her butt. It was clear to me that someone like Janet, with her charming, playful demeanor, had likely been around the block a few times. She enjoyed testing a man's limits, seeing how far she could push him before he surrendered, and then, more often than not, she moved on to her next conquest. I thought about the possible similarities of her and another, and how women like her were seldom faithful to anyone. I knew the game she was playing, and I allowed it to continue, but I never dropped my guard or revealed my innermost secrets. Janet explained that she didn't want to break the spell she was currently under or the one I was currently experiencing. Our hour-long cycle ride had passed quickly, and we found ourselves back in front of our rain-covered hotel entrance. The hotel's front was sheltered, ensuring that arriving or departing cars wouldn't be affected by the frequent and guide-train rain. I handed the cyclo driver double the amount he had asked for, and Janet suggested we take another 2-hour ride, insisting that she would pay, because she wanted to fall asleep in my arms. So we embarked on another ride, and indeed, she did fall asleep. By now, it was late, and the cyclo driver was soaked, even in his raincoat and hat. We had been sitting in his bed for quite some time. When we returned to the hotel around midnight and started in the front door, there was a sudden flash like a streak of lighting or the flash from a camera. Looking around, we didn't see anything and let that moment pass. We did notice that Mr. Land had disappeared. Mr. Heap expressed concern about not being able to locate him. I, too, was worried, but in the morning Mr. Land returned, explaining that he had visited a friend in the city the previous night. I'll bet I told Janet his friend shared her bed with him. We resumed our journey and arrived in Saigon late at night, stopping for fuel and finding as we continued that the fuel maybe had been mixed with water and the van struggled on this last leg of our journey. Once again, Mr. Lane disappeared, leaving me a message that he would see me in the morning and that he was staying with his cousin downtown. We dropped Janet off at her hotel and she invited me upstairs to see her room. I asked the van driver would wait and I gave him an extra $10 in Vietnamese money. She was on the 3rd floor of a 3-level apartment complex. I entered the room and it resembled a girly girl room unlike those you see in other homes. She rushes over to cassette player and put in a tape she bought for me and music began. She asked me if I wanted to dance. As we danced, I was laughing and I asked if she had some ulterior motives where she wanted to be that close to me. She pushed me away and looked down and said, "Sorry, Mr. Happy, but not tonight." After the dance, I said good night, and I think she wanted to kiss me, but I didn't want to keep the driver all night. I was sure he wanted to get home also. As I was leaving, her phone was ringing. I returned to the Kim Hyun. I called her in the morning to see if she was awake. When she answered, she said the phone call last night was from her boss and she was going to be busy and would call me back later, but she never did. I called again and again, hoping to meet before my departure from Vietnam, but it seemed she was back with her boyfriend. I knew that our relationship had been purely professional and that I had read too much into our brief friendship. It was the end of the puppy love. It was just a job, but her approach to it bothered me nonetheless. I didn't want to lose her. How many men have fallen into a trap of the enchantment of a woman embodying the role, much like Elvis sang in his song about life as a stage, where fate led him to play in love with her. She delivered her lines skillfully, never missing a cue. In Act 2, she changed, but he would prefer to continue hearing her lies than to go living without her. I wrote those words down back in late 1963, and they were true then and still today. My mind races back to my training, and I'm grateful for the lessons I've learned from this experience. It serves as a stark reminder never to fully trust a woman who shows romantic interest in you when it occurs suddenly and not over a long time span. I reflect on those German officers who were ensnared by their female enemies during World War II, and I wonder if I, too, had been deceived. Perhaps I had been the victim of a clever ruse, and I needed to take precautions before the authorities caught wind of it. With a sense of urgency, I gather everything I've collected, excluding my camera, and place it in a box. I turn it over to Mr. Lan, the only person I feel I can trust, and ask if he can handle a late-night transfer of these items. By morning, everything is gone, leaving me with the task of finding an alternative way to get these valuable items out of Vietnam. I dread the thought of being stopped at the airport and losing everything, now that I fully comprehend the significance of what I possess. How could I have been so foolish? Despite repeated warnings, I allowed myself to develop inappropriate feelings for Janet in just a few days, despite being a married man. Reflecting on my mission, I believe I've successfully accomplished all of my objectives except one. Unfortunately, due to washed-out roads and the lack of alternative routes, I was unable to complete it. Waiting for the ground to dry out for 2 weeks was not an option. I briefly considered walking, but the distance was a daunting 50 miles. With a few days remaining before my departure, we drove out to Kuchai, where the 25th Infantry had been stationed. There, I encountered a man who asked if I were an American and who then handed me a letter and requested that I mail it once I was back in the U.S. He instructed me to place his name at the bottom of the letter, but only after arriving in the U.S. Alongside the letter, he gave me a separate piece of paper containing his address, urging me to hide it so that the authorities would not discover. He expressed fear that if the Vietnamese authorities saw his letter, he would face trouble. I agreed to his request, and he vanished into the crowd of merchants who were setting up their stalls to sell items to the tourists. Throughout this trip, I received well over 100 letters from Vietnamese individuals, all requesting that I mail them from the U.S. Many of these letters proposed exchanging information with the U.S. government in exchange for asylum in the United States. In subsequent trips to Vietnam and over the years, I discovered that many of these letters were written by North Vietnamese individuals who had once held positions within the Vietnamese government's hierarchy. Now, they sought financial compensation for sharing their knowledge. Mr. Lan, Mr. Heap, and I arrived early at Cu Chai, and I took the opportunity to explore the tunnels that had been redesigned and opened for larger tourists to enter. While it seemed like there might have been an entrance fee, but because it was early there was no one around to collect it. Later, we sat down for drinks in what looked like a replica of an outdoor Hawaiian bar. A Vietnamese man approached us, identifying himself as a tour guide and offering to show us around the area. He claimed that during the American War, he had dug many of these tunnels. Curious about my background, he asked about my country of origin. Despite having replaced the small Canadian flag on our van antenna with an American one, he still inquired. I confirmed that I was American and admitted to having been a soldier in Vietnam. At that moment, a car pulled up and a familiar man stepped out. I had seen him a couple of times before, and I asked Mr. Heap if he could be a member of the secret police. The man introduced himself as Mr. Ho Nguyen and spoke in English. He mentioned that he was a Viet Kieu, Vietnamese American, someone of Vietnamese origin who had lived in the United States before 1975 and had returned to Vietnam. He inquired about my nationality and how I was enjoying my holiday. To ascertain his authenticity, I asked him questions that only a true Viet Kieu would know. Mr. Ho responded that he didn't know much about America as he had been living in Les Little Saigon and had limited interaction with Native Americans. When he noticed the bracelet on my wrist, which had been given to me by the mountain people we had encountered during our travels, he commented that they only bestowed such bracelets upon very special individuals. He questioned whether I considered myself special, to which I pretended to yawn, feigning boredom with his inquiries. Mr. Ho would not let the conversation end. He said, a Soviet citizen and his wife had traveled into that area and were killed, and that 4 Vietnamese policemen went into the area to investigate their death, and they never returned. That they found the jeep at the bottom of a mountain, and they soldiers were gone, maybe dragged off by an animal, maybe a tiger. He said he read in the paper where a truckload of 10 soldiers had gone into that area, and they disappeared and never found a trace of the men or the truck. I told him I didn't know anything about that. I don't read Vietnamese stories or follow this country news stories. He then asked how could so many men go into this bandit area and disappear while I go there and I come back wearing a bracelet. I said I was just a friendly guy and said I need to get going and maybe I would see him again. I engaged in a conversation with the tour guide, and I suspected he might also be from the secret police who might have also been assigned to keep an eye on foreigners who visited this tourist trap. Mr. Ho would not allow me go away. He kept following me. So I mentioned that I had been a soldier near Tam Kai and the Viet Kieu, Vietnamese American. Mr. Ho commented that he had once lived in Tam Kai and his family had fought against the Americans in that area. He even suggested that we might have fought each other during the war. He was not a very good policeman since now his story had changed where he appeared to be a former VC and not a Vietnamese returning to Vietnam. I asked myself if he was VC back then, how did he make it to America? I quipped that if we had indeed faced each other in battle, he wouldn't be here today. He laughed and shook his head in response. He had just blown his cover story because of his pride. Then when he realized his mistake, he apologized, saying it was his poor ability to translate. He made up a long story, but I didn't even listen. He said he just wanted to get my reaction and that he was really a Viet Kieu. The Viet Kieu, who I suspected was a secret policeman. I think of everyone who asks me a lot of questions as possibility being a member of the secret police. He inquired about my travels, asking which big cities I had visited and expressing his appreciation for Vietnam in peacetime. He raised the topic of whether I had been searching for American POWs, a question that seemed to come up frequently during my journey. It made me wonder whether some of the people I had encountered were also secret police. This particular officer seemed to be blowing his cover as he continued probing me about my travels, the people I had met, whether I had interacted with former South Vietnamese officers, and if I had ventured into the jungle areas. I responded vaguely to his questions and redirected the conversation to inquire about Little Saigon in LA. He revealed that his family owned a restaurant but claimed he never left the house, so he didn't know the restaurant's address. I dropped my line of questioning to avoid raising suspicions. Politely, I asked about his family and then excused myself, saying we had to leave. As soon as we drove away, I noticed that the secret police was following us in a black car, what I perceived as the police. We headed to visit the Temple of the One-Eyed God, Keadai. Later, Mr. Lan explained to me that you could often discern whether someone had hailed from North or South Vietnam during the war based on their terminology. People from the North would typically refer to it as the American War or the war against the aggressor, while those from the South might simply call it the Vietnamese War. When we reached the Cao Dai area of Vietnam, I learned that during the war this area had their own military branch of soldiers who fought the VC. We parked the van and made our way over to the temple and went and walked around and took a few photos. We didn't stay too long before we were back in the van, and I asked the driver to drive in front of the church plaza where I could get some better photos of the building. We stopped in the plaza, and I got out with Mr. Heap and took a few photos. Then I noticed a large group of schoolgirls that appeared to be in their teens, maybe 100 people walking toward me. I took a photo of them. They stopped in front of me, asked Mr. Heap of my nationality. He told them I was an American, and they began making comments. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, and the communists came, they took over the school, and they taught children that the Americans were evil and they had horns. They wanted to see my horns and left. Before long, all these girls had surrounded me and were pushing me. I started back to the van, and I told Mr. Heap that now I knew how some of the rock stars felt when their adoring fans would surround them. Mr. Heap repeated my comment, and they all laughed and began reaching out to grab my shirt and pull on it, ripping a couple buttons of the shirt. I had to fight my way back to the van where the driver noticed what was happening and had opened the side door for Mr. Heap, and I had to get in and slam the door. The girls pressed their faces up against the window, making hideous faces as we slowly drove away. Everyone thought it was funny but me. My shirt was out of my pants and it was torn open in the front. Now I really understand what rock stars like the Beatles have to go through. As we were driving, the driver could not stop laughing, finding it amusing as we drove away. He informed Mr. Heap that Mr. Ho was still trailing us. Our next destination was New Ba Din, known as the Black Woman Mountain. During the war, it was referred to as the Black Virgin Mountain. I wasn't entirely sure what awaited us at the mountain's peak, but there was a continuous stream of people ascending the concrete steps. We embarked on the climb, and I began counting the steps, stopping somewhere around 200. Fatigue overtook me, and I sat down, observing a seemingly endless procession of Buddhist monks carrying massive 80-pound bags of cement on their journey to the summit. We took a break, resting for a while and witnessing the monks with their burdens making their way up the mountain. After what felt like 20 minutes, we resumed our ascent, perspiring profusely and fending off relentless flies. We paused again at a spot where vendors were selling drinks and rice cakes. Parched and drenched in sweat, I sat down and drank a warm 33 beer. As we neared the mountain's peak, we encountered an old Buddhist temple riddled with bullet holes. It appeared to have been the site of a fierce firefight, with bullet holes pock-marking 3 sides of the building. The temple was charred and heavily damaged, likely from rocket fire. A monk with limited English proficiency pointed to the temple and shook his head to indicate we should not enter. Once we reached the mountain top, we settled in an open-air cafe-like structure. I learned that this had once been a U.S. installation for an American radio signal company. There wasn't much of significant value to see at the mountain's peak, aside from a few Buddhist buildings, a handful of structures, and a small stream rumored to contain gold. The descent was notably easier and quicker. At the bottom of the hill, Mr. Ho was waiting for us. I asked him if he had been following us, and he chuckled. I deftly sidestepped his new round of questions and re-entered the van for our return journey to Saigon. During the ride, a heavy storm descended upon us. As we crossed the bridge, we noticed a crowd of people gathered on the bridge's railing, looking over the edge. Curiosity piqued. We stopped to see what had captured their attention. Below, we witnessed bodies being carried away by the river, including a man clutching a small child and desperately raising his hand, crying for help. The river's swift current made any rescue attempt nearly impossible. A flash flood had caught villagers upstream by surprise, sweeping them away. After this grim scene, we proceeded to have lunch on the other side of the bridge. As we were about to continue our journey, my driver informed me that the water level had risen over the top of the bridge road we had recently crossed. We drove a short distance before encountering another valley where water had inundated the road. The driver made the decision to find an alternative route and veered left, taking us onto a mountain road that traversed up and down through the valley, where once again the roads had been washed out. A local boy riding on a water buffalo approached us, offering to guide us down the hillside into another valley, bypassing the flooded area. We followed his lead, driving through water that reached up to a foot deep. However, as we reached a crest, we suddenly found ourselves on an island, surrounded by water, and our vehicle was losing traction. The boy on the water buffalo seemed unperturbed, as the water only reached up to the animal's kneecaps. It's moments like these that make me reflect on my perceived invincibility, knowing that such risky decisions can have dire consequences. In these third-world countries, even the most daring adventurers can meet with tragedy. As the hours passed, we anxiously monitored our precarious situation, staying on high ground while keeping our van's headlights on and off to gauge the water's rise. We shifted the van multiple times, hoping to gain a few precious feet of dry land and avoid being submerged. I couldn't help but imagine the water rising to the point where it would envelop the van's tires, carrying us away like a boat drifting out to sea. Morning arrived, and we were still perched on high ground, but the dry area had shrunk to less than 10 square meters where our van remained precariously stationed. The boy and his buffalo had disappeared, leaving me to wonder what had become of him. In the scorching afternoon heat, we managed to traverse through a foot of mud. Of course, we got stuck a few times and had to exit the van to push it free. Eventually, we were on our way back to Saigon. Upon reaching my hotel, I found Mr. Lan waiting for me. I appreciated his company during my many travels, as he spoke English well and didn't solely focus on profiting from my experiences, unlike Mr. Heap. While driving through the city, we stopped at a cafe where a woman had a child with a head twice the size of a normal child's head. I inquired about the child's condition, but the woman was unaware of the medical term and simply knew that the child was sick and she needed money. When I asked if she had taken the child to a doctor, she couldn't provide an answer. Her primary focus was acquiring money, and she quickly tucked the funds into her bra without a word of thanks. Despite this, I gave her around $20 in Vietnamese currency, as I believed it was the right thing to do. As darkness descended, I noticed that one area of Saigon was brightly lit, while another remained in darkness. I learned that there wasn't enough electricity to illuminate the entire city, so they rationed electricity on different days of the week. The area we were driving through was currently dark, with only the glow of fires and occasional lights powered by gas generators providing illumination. I had already experienced hotels without electricity until they started their gasoline generators, but only after nightfall, and they typically ran until around 10 p.m. Mr. Lan accompanied me on some occasions, while other times, both he and I were present during our meetings. During one of these encounters, I mentioned Miss Din to him but expressed my uncertainty about whether she was the same woman. Given the pervasive deception I had encountered, Mr. Lan understood my skepticism. One evening at my hotel came Miss Din, who was accompanied by a frail elderly man who revealed that he had once worked at the U.S. Embassy as an interpreter. To substantiate his claim, he presented old identification papers with his photograph demonstrating his past employment with the Americans. The man, Mr. Huan, recounted that he had retired in 1973 and had faced imprisonment due to his association with the embassy. He shared that the woman, Miss Din, had witnessed a Viet Cong insurgent placing a bomb under some sandbags near a specific area. Details were forgotten, close to the airport. When the Americans returned, she reported this to them. Mr. Han mentioned that an American soldier had taken her hand, causing her to fear that they were going to turn her over to the police for questioning. He clarified that she was only 13 years old at the time and was quite terrified of the authorities. Consequently, she had pulled away from the American soldier and fled back to her house. In another conversation with Miss Din, she recounted a distressing incident from her past. She explained that she had once lost her purse and ID card, leading to her mother's severe punishment, which elicited a small laugh from me as I revealed that I was the American who had held her during that time. I expressed deep regret for the unfortunate events between her and her mother. During this conversation, Mr. Han served as a translator for Miss Din, as if she sought to ensure her story was conveyed accurately, possibly due to a lack of trust in Mr. Heap. Miss Din proceeded to recount a harrowing chapter of her life. In 1976, she had to sell all her possessions to secure passage on a boat operated by the communist government, which eventually set sail from Vietnam. Tragically, while at sea, numerous passengers, including men, women, and children, perished, becoming sustenance for the ocean's creatures. As she put it, Miss Din and her fellow survivors were rescued by the Vietnamese Navy and returned to Vietnam. Subsequently, she endured a year of imprisonment in horrendous conditions. In jail, she experienced abuse at the hands of a guard who forced her to remain naked in her cell. When it was time for her to work in the rice fields, she was beaten again because she had lost her clothing. She formed an unusual relationship with one guard who later became her boyfriend, securing her a sewing job, which was preferable to the grueling rice paddy labor. Unfortunately, many young girls suffered similar fates, and when they required female hygiene products, they were instructed to wash and reuse the soiled ones. The guard eventually introduced her to a man who owned a company selling paper rolls in exchange for employment. The guard encouraged Miss Din to sleep with the owner of the paper company, Miss Din was subsequently sold to this paper company owner, who paid for her release from jail, reducing her sentence to about 10 months for her attempted escape from Vietnam. This paper company owner, who I referred to as Mr. Ho, and number one to distinguish him from other individuals named Mr. Ho, became her boyfriend despite being married. She said he took care of her, but she claimed not to love him. I couldn't help but wonder why she was sharing such a personal and potentially embarrassing story with me. Perhaps she was attempting to garner sympathy, though it had little effect on me. Her body language suggested that there was more to this story than what she was revealing. She emphasized her aversion to any involvement with the police or government, expressing a preference for death over returning to jail. I assured her that upon my return to the USA, I would contact my U.S. Senator, John Danforth, and explain the situation to see if there was any way we could assist her without disclosing her actions in 1968 to the authorities. She inquired whether he could help her go to America, emphasizing her role in saving American lives. I replied that I wasn't certain, but promised to explore options when I returned home. I assured her of my willingness to help improve her current life circumstances. Miss Din shared with me that her daughter had married a Malay, a person of mixed Vietnamese and American heritage, and they were planning to come to the United States soon. She mentioned that any assistance I could provide to them would be greatly appreciated. I later learned that Miss Din had secured a significant sum of money from her boyfriend, which she intended to give to General Trong Ba, a former South Vietnamese officer who had endured years in a communist labor camp. In exchange for the money, she had orchestrated the introduction of her daughter to General Ba's nephew, Mr. Man, who was also mixed heritage. Their marriage was prearranged, and her daughter was now wedded to Mr. Man, which would grant her the opportunity to immigrate to America, a part of Operation Welcome Home. Both children had agreed to the marriage with some persuasion. Women who had children of mixed race faced severe persecution in Vietnam after the communist regime took control in 1975. They were stigmatized as prostitutes and subjected to degrading treatment, particularly in rural areas. These women were bought and sold for sexual purposes. Life was exceedingly harsh, with limited access to food and education. Consequently, some of these women resorted to selling their mixed-race children in exchange for food and shelter, while others grew up in servitude as domestic workers or servants. This meeting ended and I returned to my room, when someone was knocking at my door. It was Jim and his friends from Chu Lai. Jim, a former friend and former member of the Viet Cong, had become a policeman, and he managed to locate me on the streets of downtown Saigon. He and his friends had gone from shop to shop inquiring if anyone had seen an American. I'd been informed at the Vietnamese mission at the United Nations in early 1990 that in the previous 2 years, only around 200 Americans had applied for visas to return to Vietnam before my request, so I suppose it wasn't too challenging for him to find me. During my first trip, many boys and girls, most of whom I had photographed during wartime, followed Jim from my old base camp. I didn't want a crowd of 10 people trailing me wherever I went, so I gave them $100 to share among themselves and told them I was occupied with some business matters. Mr. Lang confided in me that he had applied for refugee status due to his past employment with the U.S. government, but his application had been denied. I must have heard stories like his, as well as others mentioned countless times during my 10 years of journey through Vietnam. It seemed that everyone I met wanted to recount their hardships because of their prior association with the Americans. On this initial trip, I collected about 100 letters from various people, all requesting that I mail them from the U.S. Some were intended for specific recipients, and I discreetly marked these envelopes to ensure they didn't go to the address listed on the front. At times, I found myself wondering about the contents of these letters, fearing that I might unknowingly be transporting something classified as espionage or treason. Carrying these letters violated the strict prohibition against becoming entangled in Vietnamese people's affairs. Moreover, sending a letter from Vietnam to the U.S. cost nearly $1, while sending one to Vietnam only cost me 50 cents. Mr. Lan asked if I would accompany him to the location where Vietnamese individuals seeking asylum in the U.S. were interviewed. It was situated just down the street from the former presidential palace in Saigon, known as Amer Asian Park, and was on the same street as the former U.S. Embassy, just a few doors away. Since I didn't know Mr. Lan well during the war, I couldn't offer much insight into his character. Nevertheless, I agreed to go with him and vouch for his credibility. At the gate, a Vietnamese security guard initially stopped us, but as soon as he glimpsed my U.S. passport, he swiftly stepped aside and allowed us to proceed. Upon entering the facility, it felt as though 100 pairs of eyes were fixated on us, as if we were celestial beings. Some individuals even dropped to their knees, imploring me for assistance, believing I held some significant sway. I navigated around them and continued onward, passing through one room after another, each teeming with Vietnamese individuals seeking entry into the U.S. My progress came to a halt at a desk obstructing a doorway where I presented my passport and expressed my desire to meet with a representative from the U.S. delegation in Bangkok. Initially, the officer hesitated to let Mr. Lan accompany me until I insisted on his presence. I spoke with a member of the American delegation, explaining that I had worked for the U.S. State Department during a mission in Vietnam, even though I was actually with DODJPAC. However, the State Department always carried more weight, and I preferred to associate with them. I mentioned that I had reconnected with an individual I knew from my days as a soldier and wanted to extend my help to him. I was ushered into a relatively luxurious office and asked to take a seat. Over the next 10 minutes, I received a dossier containing documents that needed to be completed and returned by Mr. Lan. His name would then be added to list number 7 for a future interview. The officer informed me that they were currently processing list number 7, and if Mr. Lan could promptly submit the required documents, they would insert his name at the end of that list ahead of the other 20 or so lists already scheduled. Upon reviewing the document requirements, it became clear that Mr. Lan would need to return to his city to obtain additional paperwork, which would take a few days. The only hitch was that my departure from Vietnam was imminent. Nevertheless, there was still ample time, as it would take 2 to 3 months to interview everyone on list number 7. However, by the time Mr. Lan gathered all his documents, I had already left Vietnam, and he was placed on list number 20. At that time, they were conducting interviews for only 4 lists per year. Upon leaving those offices, word had spread among the driver and Mr. Heap, who had waited in the van, that I possessed special influence with the delegation. As I emerged from the front gates, a dozen people were waiting for me, and later, they started coming to my hotel, offering money in exchange for my assistance. I took the time to sit down with each person and explain the requirements, with Mr. Lan translating for me. Meanwhile, Mr. Heap was actively promoting my name, suggesting that I could help people when, in reality, I couldn't. That afternoon, Miss Din visited my hotel, accompanied by her friend, who claimed to have previously worked at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They were all aware of my meeting with the U.S. delegation downtown and believed I had a special pass to access the building and expedite their immigration without following the standard procedures. I found myself inundated with requests for assistance. I asked Miss Din to wait for me at the cafe across the street from the Kim Hyum Hotel. She expressed frustration, believing she shouldn't have to wait her turn. She seemed to think that her actions back in 1968 entitled her to special treatment. Mr. Lan began informing me that Miss Din was not a reputable or honorable woman. She was attempting to win his favor and even offered him some money in exchange for assistance. It became clear that there was a considerable amount of deceit and betrayal in this country, as I had already been cautioned about. I had been sent to Vietnam with the mission of gathering information about missing MIA soldiers, but now I found myself involved in the Bangkok HO refugee program. These people were attempting to establish a connection where I would provide them with information, and they would compensate me and potentially offer bribes if necessary to facilitate their immigration to the U.S. The request was for me to procure blank documents for them, but I explained that it didn't work that way. They needed to formally request these documents in writing, and they would be provided to them through the proper channels. I spoke with some of these individuals, and it became evident that many of them were not being entirely truthful. Mr. Heap had taken over most of the translation duties, now receiving a small tip in return, and I closely observed his body language. I suspected that he was trying to convince these people that I possessed extraordinary abilities, like walking on water. Finally, I had to intervene and told Mr. Heap that he needed to clarify the requirements to these people since I had already repeated the process twice. Some of them had money and eagerly pushed it in front of Mr. Heap, hoping to secure a meeting with the delegation. I inquired whether he was concerned about his mother or the girl who had helped him, and he replied that they could take care of themselves. It was an answer that didn't sit well with me, but it likely reflected his perspective. In my mind, it wasn't a satisfactory response. However, it might have been his honest assessment of the situation. He began raising chickens and repairing radios and, on occasion, black and white TVs. Whenever he had to go into the village to buy something, people would point at him and accuse him of working for the Americans. Those informants would receive a small tip of 3 or 4 cents for their efforts. The police would question him but ultimately release him. He lived with the constant fear that someone might seek revenge against him at night. In 1990, a meal could be purchased for 5 cents, and most of the bribes I paid were just 50 cents, including those to police and guards. I asked him about the current situation in his village. He confirmed that it was still somewhat the same at times, The last 5 years had seen some improvements, but he was still not allowed to have a good job. He recounted how the communists had arrived, ordering former South Vietnamese officers and government workers to bring food and clothing for a 7-day re-education program, promising they'd return home afterward. However, that 7 days turned into 7 years in forced labor camps, and in some cases, it continued to this day. According to him, the government had put up signs on every building and announced on the radio that all officers, former government officials, and those who had worked for the Americans had to report to a collection center for 7 days of re-education. This was a deceit, as it actually took 7 days just to reach the re-education camps, where they would spend anywhere from 3 to 8 years. Those who failed to appear would be arrested, and their families would also face imprisonment. If anyone knew of a former officer or government official in hiding and didn't report it, they too would be arrested. The government went so far as to apprehend individuals and families attempting to conceal these officers and publicly announce those who had been detained, making examples of them to enforce compliance with the law. Mr. Land shared stories of officers boarding trucks, bidding farewell to their wives and children, then driving off into the jungle, never to be seen again. Some prisoners managed to send letters, and their families learned of their whereabouts by paying bribes to the VC. Those prisoners with wives and children lost their homes when North Vietnamese soldiers occupied their residences. If the wives and children remained in their husbands' houses, they were forcibly relocated to the economic zones, where farming was nearly impossible. Alternatively, they became victims of sexual exploitation and were taken as second wives by the VC. The houses that belonged to their husbands were seized, leaving these women homeless. Many resorted to selling themselves on the streets for food or a few cents. With many people leaving Vietnam on boats, the government offered a deal. Relinquish your home, land, motorcycle, or car, and you could leave on one of their government boats. People signed over their properties to the government and then had to travel to Da Nang and wait for their boat. Thousands of people walked the streets with boat tickets in hand. A small boat would arrive and take some people away, but they would vanish without a trace. The government claimed the boat had sunk in a storm, offering apologies but no compensation, having lost their homes. These people were left with outstretched hands, begging for survival. Since no more government boats were departing Vietnam, they couldn't reclaim their properties. The government forced them onto trucks and sent them to the economic zone, promising houses and farms that were nothing but lies. Mr. Land shared countless stories with me, and from his body language and tears, it was evident that he was relaying the truth as he knew it or had heard it from others. I provided him with my home address and around $50, encouraging him to contact me. This is a glimpse into the realities of communism in today's world, often referred to as socialism in the U.S. Afterward, I crossed the street to meet Miss Din at the cafe. She was annoyed that I had spoken with Mr. Land for so long, keeping her waiting. She insisted that people from Mr. Land's area were habitual liars and thieves, utterly untrustworthy. She claimed that anything Mr. Land had told me was a fabrication. I found it amusing because he had said the same about her. She returned, asserting that she was a highly honorable woman, but circumstances in a controlled country had forced her to take extreme measures to survive. She claimed that my friendship was a stroke of luck for me because she only wanted to shield me from other Vietnamese individuals who might try to rob me. It seemed she viewed me as a typical man easily swayed by sweet words. I couldn't help but think about Janet and chuckled at my own naivety. I told her that I believed her, or perhaps I wanted to believe her at that moment. I allowed her to become a closer friend, and for a while Mr. Land took a backseat in my thoughts. I genuinely liked Mr. Land. I had invited him into my room once and had even left several $100 bills on the table with my VN money and wallet, only to find them untouched after I came out of the shower. This act made it clear to me that Mr. Lang could be trusted. It would have been easy for him to take everything and disappear, but he didn't, so I felt confident in placing my trust in him. On the other hand, Mr. Heap was a different story. He seemed like an outlaw, but I might have to keep him around since he was in Saigon, while Mr. Land lived in the Chu Lai area, and it cost him a lot of money to travel south. 2 days before my departure from Vietnam, Mr. Lang came to my door and invited me to join him across the street at the cafe. He asked about Janet, and I explained that she was like a bird that came into my life when I needed wings to fly, but had now flown away. I didn't reveal all the details, but my words were polite. Mr. Lane mentioned that he had been at the cafe the previous night, trying to find me, but I wasn't in my room. He shared that he had met an entire family of young girls working at the cafe and that one of them had offered him intimacy. Then he proposed a day trip to Vung Tau Beach. Since I had never been to Vung Tau, I agreed to go, but I wasn't expecting to be accompanied by 4 girls. As I entered the van, I didn't turn around to look at the last seat, and the girls were discreetly hunched down to avoid being seen by the neighbors in their living and working area. I didn't notice the girls until we were already on the road, and had I known earlier, I wouldn't have allowed them to travel with me. It turned out that the girls had brought along picnic lunches for all of us, or so I thought. Later, after our arrival in Vung Tau, I discovered that the picnic baskets were filled with beer that they intended to sell. In Vung Tau, the girls rented bathing suits, and we all went for a swim. Afterward, Mr. Land took us to a nearby street where we could have lunch. I had initially assumed that the girls had prepared a picnic lunch, but it turned out to be items they were selling or shop, along with beer. Following lunch, 2 of the girls were close to me while the other 2 were with Mr. Land and the driver. I informed Mr. Land that I was married and extremely faithful to my wife. He inquired about Janet and me, and I clarified that nothing happened between us. There was no intimacy, and all we did was share the same bed and occasionally hold hands to maintain the appearance of a married couple. Now he understood that I was strictly there on business. Throughout Vietnam, there were cabins where travelers could rest for an hour during the heat of the day. Most people use these places as a location for sexual encounters, either with local individuals or their companions at the time. Despite not having had any sexual involvement with the 2 girls, they still expected payment, as their primary reason for joining the beach trip was to make money. Mr. Land suggested I didn't need to pay them, but I gave each of them 10,000 dong and covered their lunch at a local restaurant. I also warned Mr. Land never to arrange such encounters again, or it would jeopardize our friendship. Mr. Land was under the impression that during the war, nearly every American soldier had girlfriends, and he assumed I must have had a few as well. I corrected him, explaining that while many soldiers may have had girlfriends, I was in love with a girl back in the U.S., and I didn't want to risk contracting any diseases and potentially bringing them home. Mr. Land patted me on the shoulder, either considering me a good guy or perhaps finding my caution amusing. Following that conversation, he never introduced me to any ladies of the night, although he continued to enjoy their company, funded in part by the money I had given him. We were back in Saigon after witnessing 2 accidents on the road. The first involved a beautiful young girl in a white dress lying in the road, covered in blood, and the second was a guy who appeared to be drunk and had crashed into a telephone pole. Miss Din was waiting for me at the hotel when we got out of the van. She instructed Mr. Heap to convey to me that the girls in the van were prostitutes. This may have been true, but I was unaware of it until we were on the road. I explained to her that I was married and didn't engage in such activities. The owner of the van came to the hotel to settle the final payment for our trip. I paid him everything owed except the money I had given to the police for protection. I told him to return to the police station and retrieve that money since his policeman had not accompanied me on the day of my departure. He insisted that I had to go to the police station with him because they would not return the money to him directly. Reluctantly, I agreed to accompany him to the police station. Once there, with Mr. Heap translating, I requested the return of my $150 protection money, emphasizing that the police had not fulfilled their part of the arrangement by providing me with protection on the day I left. The police responded by suggesting that I consider a tip for their services. They asked if I would ever return to Vietnam, and if so, I could come to see them, and they would assign policemen to protect me from bandits. In response, I remarked that, based on my experience, it seemed more like the police needed protection from bandits, not me. I thanked them but declined their offer, stating that I didn't require their protection, and if anything, they were the ones who needed protection from me. I was stern, but the van owner and Mr. Heap seemed reluctant to repeat my words to the police officer. I insisted that they convey my message accurately, word for word, and as close as possible. I explained to the police officer that his man had never shown up at the hotel, and we had waited for over an hour with no sign of him. I emphasized that this had wasted a considerable amount of my time, and I demanded my money back. Mr. Heap finally relayed my message to the police officer. To add weight to my words, I mentioned that I had spoken to the Third Secretary, Mr. Tran Min Zong, at the United Nations mission in the U.S., who happened to be a friend of mine. I placed Mr. Zung's business card on the desk in front of the police officer and claimed that I had asked Mr. Zung whether I could contact him if I encountered any problems in Vietnam, to which I was told yes. Although this wasn't entirely true, Mr. Zung had assured me that I wouldn't face any issues in Vietnam. I then made it clear that I wanted my $150 back immediately, or I would consider faxing Mr. Zung to inform him that a police officer was attempting to scam me out of $150. I asserted that I didn't know for sure what consequences this might have for the officer, maybe even for his family, but I didn't care. If I didn't receive the money, I was willing to let the situation unfold. The police officer, clearly agitated, threw some papers down on his desk, left the room briefly, returned, and forcefully placed the $150 US on the table. He sternly instructed me to leave and declared that he never wanted to see me again. Mr. Heap was visibly shocked and trembling, and he kept discussing the incident with the driver until we reached my hotel. The driver, on the other hand, repeatedly turned around to look at me and chuckled. Mr. Heap noted that a Vietnamese person would never dare to speak to a policeman in such a manner, otherwise they would likely end up in jail indefinitely. When I returned to the Kim Huong Hotel, I found both Janet and Miss Din waiting for me, each eager to take me out to dinner. I declined Miss Din's offer, explaining that I had already made plans to dine with my friend Janet. With a disappointed look, Din walked away, muttering to herself. It was December 23, 1990, and Janet and I strolled down the street, where there must have been a company that baked bread and sweet smell make me want to buy some. We went into a small cafe and we talked. I wanted to ask her what had happened, but I thought if it were any of my business, she would tell me I just wanted to have her beside me. It didn't want to tell her how much I missed her, and they might lead into words I did want to hear. In my mind, I thought she had returned to her boyfriend, and she just put me in her past. I just wanted to try to enjoy the remaining day or two with her by my side. Janet didn't say much as she simply gazed at me and then brought me 2 hamburgers and some fries. In my gratitude, I affectionately called her my guardian angel. We enjoyed our American-style dinner while watching the throngs of people passing by on the street. As we concluded our dinner and she asked me what was I going to do with all those products I purchased, I said just taking care of business. I told her I collected the shoulder patches and they were somewhat easy to find in the city. Ordering wine, Janet's demeanor changed. She filled her glass up to the very top and drank it all down in one swallow. I knew something was coming and that it was probably going to be bad news for me. She revealed that her boyfriend had broken up with her, and she was being sent back to the Philippines in a few days. Expressing my sympathy, I asked her what led to the breakup. She lightly tapped my arm and appeared to be unfazed and explained that she suspected that the secret police had followed and had photographed us when we were skinny dipping up at Geelong. To her dismay, photos of us dancing nude in the sand together were sent to her boyfriend. She had a business card, and she flipped it onto the table. I picked up the card, and it gave the name of the police and his office address. I did not recognize the name, but I asked her if this was the name of the secret policeman. She said she didn't know, but it was the card that accompanied the photo sent to her boyfriend. I picked up the card, and Janet looked away, and I put the card in my shirt pocket. This revelation was something I knew I'd have to include in my report, and I couldn't help but wonder about my boss's reaction. Janet, however, still seemed unfazed and said that she had intended to break up with him anyway. She just wished it had been on her terms rather than his. She mentioned her plan to return to the Philippines after the new year and suggested that we might meet again once we were both back in the United States. I think she started to cry, and I said maybe after I leave Vietnam, then you two might get back together. She gave me a smiling but crying laugh and said she didn't want to get back with him. She wanted to be with me. I never expected that. I'd never hear a woman ever say to me she wanted to be with me. Janet looked at me with a tear in her eyes and said she had the most exciting time of my life with me, and you're the only man I have ever shared a bed with who wasn't interested in sleeping with me. She asked me if I ever thought of what it would be like if we made love. Laughing and holding her hand tight, I said I thought about it every single night and most every hour of the day. She asked me if I was serious or was I just saying that to make her feel good. I can't believe, but the moment overtook me and I leaned over and kissed her forehead, and she caught my head and kissed me on the lips. I told her in so many words that she was the best thing to ever happen to me since my first love, and that perhaps she was even better because I knew her feeling while I never knew my childhood sweethearts. She asked me if I was in love with my wife, and I said yes, but it not the same as a romantic love. It more of a love where you take care of each other. Yes, probably 90% of all marriages are like that after the first year. I asked the waitress if I could buy an envelope and stamp from her, and then I asked her if she would address it from a business card I had in my pocket. Janet gave me the strangest look. What are you doing, Mr. Bond? Are you going to send him a letter? Yes, saying thank you for giving me the romantic moment. I placed the envelope in my shirt pocket. We left the dinner and began to walk the street, watching all the people carrying wrapped Christmas packages on the back of their motorcycle. She held my hand, and as we walked she rested her head on my shoulder. I had this feeling I had wanted all my life, and here it was right alongside of me and ripping me apart. Janet asked if I wanted to go for a ride in a cycle, and maybe order rainfall and darkness if it were on the menu. We climbed onto the cycle, and she seemed to just want to hold onto my arm and fall asleep on my shoulder. There was an accident in front of us, and traffic was back up. So we got out and went into a street-side cafe. We sat here and once again watched the traffic. It started to rain, and then lightning struck the electric pole in front of the cafe, throwing sparks. Sounded like an incoming round, and I'm glad no one had to pull me out from under that table. Michael, she said, let's do something exciting like. Then she paused as she tried to think of something exciting like trying to outrun the police on a motorbike. I love the adrenaline rush, she said. No, thank you, I don't go out in search of getting in trouble. I'm not over here to search for trouble. I'm here to gather information and get back home alive. I said you watch too many James Bond movies. Those are fantasy, not reality. So that's not part of your everyday life, she asked. No, paying the bill and taking care of my family is my everyday life. I took this job solely because of the money and later the mini adventure of traveling back to Vietnam where my nightmares once began. Once again, she said she took it because she thought it would be exciting but never dreamed it would be this exciting. I saw a pharmacist shop across the street. I asked Janet if she would accompany me and she asked if I had a headache. In Vietnam, you can purchase most any chemical or drug from a pharmacist, and I had her purchase the 2 chemical compounds for me. She asked me what was I going to do with this stuff. I said I had a plan. I visited 2 more pharmacists and purchased 2 sets of large plastic gloves. The lady in the pharmacy gave me a long stare and Janet spoke to the lady. Janet turns to me and says, what are you going to do? Are you going to kill someone? Why are you buy this stuff? And I said it was part of my mission and it best if you don't ask too many questions. You're going to kill someone, aren't you? I know what you got there. Who is it? By this time the streets were bustling with people, so we walked a short distance before getting another psycho who took me back to my hotel. We settling down on the roof balcony of a 2-story cafe, across the street from my hotel and listening to the music, mostly current American music. When Air Supply began to sing All Out of Love, she held my arm again and began to cry, saying, I don't want you to leave, Mr. Bond, unless you take me with you. The music was playing in the cafe and Janet talked to the waitress and gave her some money and in a few minutes Richard Marx began singing Right Here Waiting for You, Janet. You don't know me and I don't know you, and we're both tied up to this moment in our lives where we both experience something that may only come by once in a lifetime because of these memories. But then in a short time when life catches up with us, it will fade in a few days, weeks, or months. She looks up at me and nods her head yes and say, I want time to stop and remain here with you. After a while, she let the matter drop and she inquired about getting a room at the Kim Huong Hotel, as she felt it would be challenging to find a taxi and make her way home in the crowded streets. I spoke to Kim, the hotel owner, and was informed that there were no available rooms. At that point, Janet looked at me and asked if it would be all right for her to stay in my room. I hesitated, considering my options, and finally said, I guess so, despite my inner reservations. We made our way to my room, which had a balcony overlooking the lively street below. I confessed to her that I liked her more than anyone I had met in the past 2 decades, but I also recounted a story about another woman who left without a trace and never contacted me again. Later, I found out she had gotten back together with her ex-boyfriend. Janet interrupted me, saying, John, I was going to break up with Robert, but when he confronted me with those photos, I had to explain things, hoping to salvage my job, but it didn't work out. I nodded, understanding her predicament, and continued with 2 more of my stories. One about a woman named Sandy Cooper and another girl from my youth. Janet interjected, asserting that she wasn't like those women and didn't want to hear about anyone else. I acknowledged her statement, admitting that I had always known this but felt the need to discuss it now. Tears welled up in Janet's eyes, and I couldn't discern whether they were genuine or feigned. I tried not to dwell on it. She turned to me and said, Mr. Bond, you will always be my hero, and men like you are a rare breed. If you give me a chance, I'll prove that I'm not like the others in your life. I remained silent, and she leaned her head on my shoulder. Once again, she expressed hope that I might contact her when I returned home, suggesting that we could start anew from day one. I reiterated for the 3rd time that I was married and significantly older than her, and that she should seek out a nice guy. She hit my chest hard when I said that and told me to stop talking about her finding another man. With a hint of sadness in her eyes, she revealed that she had indeed found a good man, but he was already married, and with 3 children. Still curious about her line of work, I asked if she was a government employee, suspecting she was with the CIA. She still remained evasive in her response, never confirming her affiliation. Instead, she shared that she had to return to her company in the Philippines, where she was on a short-term job contract paid for by the U.S. government. She disclosed that she had initially been compensated to assist me if needed, but had unexpectedly fallen in love with me. She added, It's so easy for a woman to fall in love with you, Mr. Bond. She appeared to be crying. Over the next 10 years, every mention of James Bond in books, movies, or elsewhere would trigger memories of Janet. Upon my return to the U.S., I inquired about Janet during my debriefing at LAX and later when discussing my next mission with my American contact. Both times, I received no information about her. Interestingly, in my after-action report, I had mentioned her, and many years later, when reading Nelson Demel's book, The Country, I noticed similarities with a character in the book who seemed remarkably like Janet, although Janet, in my memory, was even better. Many years later, I learned that the writer Nelson Demel had come across my declassified after-action report and wrote my story in his book. The difference was in his book was a vice president of the United States while in Vietnam had killed an American and not a U.S. senator who killed a fellow POW, as I learned in the 16mm film. As my last night in Saigon drew to a close, Janet and I spent most of the evening talking as we watched the fireworks. She had originally come to the Kim Huong Hotel in search of an American and had discovered that I already had an interpreter, Mr. Heap. Having converted my money into Vietnamese dong, I moved forward with our plans while Janet patiently waited for instructions. I left Saigon on my mission a few weeks ago, and she lost me until I returned, and she was waiting for instructions. She was told to meet me in Da Nang and travel with me if she could. She became interested in me. She said she enjoyed herself, and then she kissed me one time, and I think I may have kissed her back. She left me early in the darkness of Christmas morning, the day I was to depart Vietnam. I found a note on my bed which I still have that says, Mr. Bond, good luck and maybe we might meet again. I really did fall in love with you. I kissed this letter so you can kiss it too and remember me. Love, Janet. Quite honestly, I've kissed that letter more than a few times, so if you want, I'm taking my heart with me when it really's still with you. Janet made a special request for me not to take any photos of her during our time together, but Mr. Heap managed to capture a distant shot of her. Before parting ways, I shared my home address with her, and she later sent me a photograph of herself from her nursing days in the Philippines. Janet explained that she had chosen to stay in the Philippines rather than return to the U.S. and extended an invitation for me to visit her in Manila. Among all the women I've known, Janet was the only one who ever tempted me to stray from my marriage, although I remained faithful. I have a deep respect for women who have saved my life, and Janet was one of only two who fell into that category. In my after-action report, I included the information about Janet without disclosing the details of our final conversation. Christmas morning arrived, and I learned of a tragic accident that had occurred in front of my hotel. The streets of Saigon on Christmas Eve and New Year's Day were packed with people, and the previous night was no exception. As I prepared to leave, I heard about a horrific accident involving a truck that claimed the lives of 8 individuals, including 2 of the girls who had accompanied me from the cafe to the beach. As I loaded my belongings into the van, a man and his family approached me. He inquired if I had been a former American soldier, to which I replied in the affirmative. He explained that he had heard about an American staying at the Kim Huong Hotel and had traveled on their motorcycle for over an hour with his family just to meet me. I anticipated that he might have important documents or a letter to share, but instead, he expressed his heartfelt gratitude for my service as a soldier in Vietnam. He urged me to convey his thanks to all former American soldiers who had served in Vietnam on behalf of the South Vietnamese people. We shook hands, and his wife and 2 young children joined in the gesture. I told him that I had never received a welcome home in the United States when I returned in 1969, but the warm reception I was receiving in Vietnam now meant more to me than words could express. Throughout my stay, I encountered numerous individuals who smiled, waved, or extended a handshake as their way of expressing gratitude and thanks. I left the hotel in the early morning and headed to the airport, where hundreds of people were gathered to bid farewell to departing passengers. Amid the crowd, I witnessed an attempted pickpocketing incident, which escalated quickly. The airport police swiftly arrived and forcefully subdued the pickpocket, beating him while he lay on the ground. Upon reaching the customs checkpoint, I was required to open all my baggage and lay its contents on the floor for inspection. I had concealed the 16mm film in the secret compartment of my Alice backpack, making it appear empty to the inspectors. They did not pick up the bag, which would have revealed its unusual weight. A young female inspector meticulously examined my belongings, and I offered her a friendly smile, hoping it might make the process smoother. Perhaps it did, as she responded with a shy smile of her own before instructing me to repack my bags and move on. I smiled back, expressing my gratitude, but she quickly reverted to her stern demeanor, perhaps worried about being seen by others. After repacking my belongings, I dropped them off at the ticket counter to be stowed in the plane's cargo hold. Then I returned to the sweltering waiting area to await the arrival of my flight. Finally, the time came for us to proceed through the door and up the stairs onto the aircraft. As I reached the aircraft door, I paused for a moment, just as I had in 1969 when leaving the war. Back then, I had turned around, extended both my hands with my middle finger raised, and uttered a "fuck you, Vietnam," before boarding the plane. Now, it was Christmas Day 1990, 21 years later, and as I turned around, I felt a moistness in my eyes. This time, I didn't want to leave. I had just lived through one of the most exhilarating adventures of my life, and now I was flying away from it. As I settled into my seat, I reflected on my earlier worries about customs finding something to prevent my departure, but I had successfully cleared customs. We waited on the sweltering runway inside the aircraft for nearly an hour before taking off. As I sat on the plane, I couldn't help repeating to myself, "It's not over until this plane leaves the ground." Despite my eagerness to leave, I found myself growing sentimental about the country I was departing from. I was going to miss Vietnam, and no, I didn't want to leave. Upon leaving Saigon, I eventually landed in Manila, the Philippines, on Christmas Day. I soon realized that there were no outgoing flights on Christmas Day, leaving me with two options: stay at the airport for 38 hours or find accommodation in the city. The airport was heavily guarded, with soldiers carrying their machine guns at the ready. They questioned me repeatedly. It cost me $13 to leave the airport and an additional $13 for re-entry. Outside, a woman directed me to a taxi, and the driver gave her a tip. During the ride to the hotel, the driver asked if I wanted the company of a woman for the night. I declined politely, but later left my Nikon camera in the taxi. The driver, upon realizing this, returned the camera, but then suggested he could arrange for a lady of the night to join me for the night as a gesture of gratitude for bringing back my camera. I gave him a $5 tip on top of the $5 he had already received for taking me to the hotel. The hotel was an older building, and after checking in, I was taken to the 5th floor. In the elevator, we experienced an unsettling delay, which made me fear I might be stuck there for the night. On the 5th floor, as we walked down the dimly lit hallway, 2 rats scurried across our path. The driver informed me that rats were a common sight in the country. I entered my room, rested briefly, but soon felt incredibly thirsty. Venturing back down to the lobby, I hoped to avoid any rat encounters. The hotel was pitch dark, with no lighting in the hallway except for a switch near the elevator and a small light above the door. I exchanged more money and used vending machines to purchase some snacks and drinks. The lobby and hotel were deserted at this late hour, except for the dim light above the reception desk. Back in my room, I heard gunshots and rushed to the window to investigate. A gunfight was unfolding in the parking lot below. It continued for a few minutes until the sound of approaching police sirens brought it to an end. The following day, I returned to the airport, paying another $13 to enter, and endured another lengthy wait. Upon arriving back in Los Angeles, I encountered a woman before going through U.S. Customs. She asked for my name and directed me to a different area where a man awaited me. He mentioned that they had been waiting for me for a long time, unaware that I had spent all of Christmas Day in the Philippines. I was directed to a table where I handed over the 16mm film and a few documents I had brought back. They returned all but 2 of the letters, inquired about the missing French one, which I explained was confiscated, and instructed me to include this information in my report. After a brief 10-minute debriefing, I was escorted by golf cart to my departure gate. Upon my return, I embarked on an overnight flight back home. It was only upon my arrival home that I realized the VHS tape wouldn't work in the United States due to the difference in electricity frequency. Vietnam uses 50 Hz while the U.S. uses 60. I needed an electric converter. My main objective was to identify the American depicted in the film. I decided to pass on the VHS tape anonymously to the League of American POW families, as the footage contained more than just the faces of American POWs that had also documented a murder. To clarify, American Yoda lists were not typically kept in bamboo cages, except for brief periods during transportation. The depiction of bamboo cages in movies like Rambo is not accurate. In reality, they were housed in buildings, some of which I had personally seen and photographed during my travels. Within 2 weeks of my return, I began receiving letters from Vietnam. By the 3rd or 4th week, I had received over 30 letters from women who claimed that I was a long-lost boyfriend and that they had children waiting for me. Many of these letters included photos showing the mother and child together, implying that I might be the father they were seeking. I took the time to respond to each of these letters, totaling over 200 in all. I printed out standardized letters in Vietnamese, explaining that they needed to find someone proficient in English to translate their letters for me. I expressed my regrets but clarified that it was impossible for me to have fathered a child since I had not been intimate with any woman in Vietnam. I wished them luck in their search and included a new American $1 bill in each letter to help cover the postage cost for their initial correspondence. There were moments when I felt a deep connection to the photos of their children and contemplated adopting some of them. A few years later, I would indeed adopt 32. 40 children, a relatively straightforward process considering the dire economic conditions in Vietnam, where the average yearly income for a family was less than $200. In post-war Vietnam, women who had children of mixed heritage were often labeled as prostitutes, subjected to public scorn, and sometimes forced into the profession, as there was little assistance available to them. These children faced discrimination, being denied access to education and medical care. Many of these Vietnamese women, unable to support themselves, let alone a child, resorted to selling their infants as domestic laborers in rural areas. To address this humanitarian crisis, the U.S. government initiated Operation Welcome Home in the 1980s. Under this program, these children, along with the individuals caring for them, were allowed to immigrate to the United States. As I continued my work as a federally employed agent in Vietnam, my name began to appear in Vietnamese newspapers due to several unauthorized humanitarian projects I had undertaken. These actions, while well-intentioned, were not officially sanctioned by the U.S. government. I received a letter from a Mr. Ho in Vietnam, the one who once lived in Chu Lai, stating that the girl named Linda, who had been killed below Hill 54, was not my girlfriend as previously thought. It turned out there was a case of mistaken identity, and the victim was a different girl. Linda had her home taken away by the VC after 1975 and was forcibly relocated to the economic zone, jungle, to clear land and make it suitable for farming. Mr. Hoa provided photographic evidence to support his claim. I wrote back asking a series of questions, and she wrote back answering them all. He asked if I was aware that the old village chief, Mr. Long, his wife, and 2 grandchildren had died when their home had caught fire on the last night I was in that city. He warned me the police might want to talk to me when I returned. I received a letter to the same effect when Mr. Lan, who wrote to me to be careful if I should ever return. The police wanted to talk to me. I received a letter from Janet just prior to my birthday in January 1991 informing me of the same information. She had asked me previously if there was something I wanted for my birthday, and I said the greatest gift anyone could ever give me would be a love letter just recalling moments we had been together. She sent it to me. Over the next 9 years, I received thousands of letters, predominantly from women, showering me with unwarranted praise for various reasons and expressing their desire to meet me someday. Like any man, I enjoyed the attention of beautiful women, and in my eyes, they were all beautiful regardless of others' opinions. As a result, I met and had lunch with hundreds of these women. I often requested to take their photos, and they readily agreed, often expressing an interest in meeting me again the following day. However, it was rare for me to follow through on these subsequent meetings, and I seldom saw the same girl twice. It was evident that some of them were involved in the profession, while the majority were young women hoping for a better life with an American, and some simply sought a free meal. One commonality among them was that almost all were at least 25 years younger than me. When they learned my age from Mr. Lan, they would often say that age was not important, emphasizing the value of love, kindness, and laughter. As part of my professional network, one of my former subordinates left our organization and started his own detective agency, specializing in divorce cases and missing persons. Shortly before the turn of the century, I reestablished contact with him and eventually hired him to locate Janet and another woman from my past. He cautioned me about the high cost associated with finding these individuals. Around 3 to 4 months later, I received a call from him, and we arranged to meet. He had compiled a substantial file on both of these women, and I requested a summary to avoid spending hours sifting through the extensive documents. He began by telling me about Janet, explaining that she had a child out of wedlock at the young age of 14, and her parents took custody of the child. She subsequently joined the Marines and worked as a military police officer before transitioning into various government organizations. While he didn't have specifics about these organizations, he knew she earned a substantial income from her employment. He mentioned that Janet had lived a promiscuous life and remained single, residing in Alexandria, Virginia, where she worked as a political analyst. He disclosed that, for several years, she had been involved with 2 boyfriends simultaneously. He provided me with more detailed information from the file and handed me her unlisted phone number. Additionally, he informed me about the other woman's history, which included an early-age childbirth, 2 marriages with subsequent divorces, and a current secret relationship marked by infidelity. He emphasized that once people enter such a lifestyle, they rarely change. Drawing an analogy, he asked if I'd ever watched the Jerry Springer Show, implying that these women might tell me what I wanted to hear. cautioning me not to take their words at face value, as they were professionals. I acknowledged this reality, well aware of it, and was prepared to accept whatever might transpire. I made attempts to contact both women, but my efforts only succeeded in reaching Janet. Despite how virtuous a woman may be, there's often an underlying belief that she can change a man, a notion that usually doesn't hold true. This dynamic works the same way with men and often leads to disappointment. This is the end of my first mission as a high-paid tourist. In Mission 2, you will learn more about Miss Din and her treachery and how I was threatened to be turned over to the secret police or pay an extortion fee of $10,000. Also, the story of Miss Leon Nguyen and how she was arrested and sent to a hard labor camp where I had to attempt a bribe-paying rescue. I only have 6 missions that I have written in short stories. Janet would join me again on mission number 6 when we assisted in obtaining the escape of a female in North Korea. Janet and I have been good friends for over 30 years. She is one of the few females I can trust in saving my life and getting me out of trouble.
This is the conclusion of mission number 1 of the tenure of a high-paid tourist. I hope you enjoyed it. In 1993, I was interviewed regarding a different adventure, and John's name came up in the interview. This is an excerpt from that interview. Tootles, Janet Sable. The complete interview of 1993 or 1994 has been lost.
Oh, John Wells just sold my place in 3 days, and that's pretty impressive for my friends and family that did ask how it went. I think a lot of people that are in my generation or my stage of life ready to make their first house purchase stood with John Wells and said, oh, no question about it, here's his number, here's his mobile, give him a quick ring. He has a really nice positive way of looking at things, and he's an optimist, which I quite like as well. But of course, that level of professionalism that you would expect for an agent of this calibre is just really appreciated at that time when everything's a bit stressful and too hard. Before I signed up with Custom with John Wills, but I did know of him through a friend years ago that he'd